Marcos walked slowly through the cold corridors of the courthouse, dressed in his prison uniform. Each step echoed off the high, somber walls, a constant reminder of his reality. The accused, the defendant. He felt the weight of every disdainful, judgmental glance, as though he'd already been condemned before even stepping into that room. The handcuffs around his wrists bit into his skin, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the humiliation that coursed through him. He tried to keep his head high, but it was impossible. The shame and exhaustion weighed on him like a heavy shadow, dragging his shoulders down with each step. Every footfall brought back memories of his efforts to stay out of trouble, to work honestly, to do the right thing. And yet, here he was, treated like a criminal, at the mercy of a system that rarely offered second chances to people like him. As he neared the courtroom door, Marcos felt his heartbeat quicken. It wasn't fear exactly, but something closer to anguish. The past few weeks had been a blur of interrogations, sleepless nights, and endless questions. He had denied any involvement in the crime he was accused of countless times, but the suspicion clung to him, like an invisible, indelible mark. "Let's go, Marcos." The guard's voice was dry and impersonal, as if he were escorting someone without a name, without a story. He nodded without saying a word, taking the final steps to the doorway. He took a deep breath, trying to summon strength. He knew that everything that happened inside that room would determine the course of his life. Still, he couldn't shake the look of resignation on his face, the expression of a man too tired to keep fighting. Inside, the air was cold, the atmosphere austere, and the silence nearly absolute. The wooden benches, the neatly aligned tables, the calculating eyes of lawyers and clerks, it all seemed designed to intimidate, to remind him of his place. Marcos took his seat at the defendant's table, trying to ignore the muffled murmurs around him. He knew what people must be thinking. A black man in handcuffs, wearing a prison uniform, it was the kind of scene everyone seemed to interpret the same way. And he knew that, for many of them, he was already guilty, no matter what he said or did. As he waited, Marcos's mind filled with questions. Asterisk, how did I get here? Where did I go wrong? Why does it feel like nothing I do is ever enough? Asterisk, they were questions he couldn't answer, and the silence around him only made them echo louder. The sound of firm footsteps interrupted his thoughts, and he realized the judge was about to enter. Marcos lifted his head, trying to brace himself for the moment, though it was hard to summon any sense of hope. Quietly, he drew a deep breath, waiting for the first word that would mark the beginning of his trial. The door in front of Marcos opened, and the judge entered, her posture serious and almost rigid. She wore the black robe that symbolized authority and impartiality, but it wasn't just that which caught his attention. When she raised her eyes to look at the defendant for the first time, something inside Marcos shattered. It was Anna. The judge standing before him was Anna, his childhood friend. For a moment, he almost forgot where he was, the coldness of the courtroom dissolving into a wave of memories that crashed over him without warning. Years ago, he and Anna had been inseparable. They had grown up together, playing soccer in the streets, sharing dreams and plans for the future, laughing at silly jokes, and facing the challenges of youth with the kind of bond only true friends know. But life had pulled them apart. He never knew what had become of Anna, and she likely thought the same of him. Seeing his old friend now, the woman who had once known him better than anyone, standing there as a figure of authority ready to judge him, the irony was sharp and cruel. Anna recognized him immediately, too. Her eyes wavered for just a split second, betraying her surprise, before she returned to her formal demeanor. She was a judge, after all, and she had a role to play. But Marcos noticed that brief hesitation, a fraction of a second that didn't escape him. She cleared her throat, trying to regain her composure, but her voice came out slightly unsteady when she finally spoke. "Let's begin," Anna announced, her tone firm. Yet it was as if her words carried a weight she herself wasn't sure how to bear. Marcos felt a flood of conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to stand up, to approach her, to try to reclaim the bond they had lost. Another part of him felt ashamed, as though he had somehow betrayed that friendship. He wondered what Anna must think, seeing him there, dressed in a prison uniform, handcuffed, surrounded by suspicion. As she read through the opening procedures, Marcos could only think about how their lives had taken such different paths. He kept his head down, struggling to hide the expression of shame and sorrow that now seemed impossible to contain. Anna continued with the formalities of the trial, but her gaze kept drifting back to him, even if only for a second. Every time their eyes met, Marcos felt a pang of pain, as if this unexpected reunion was tearing open an old wound. Deep down, Anna seemed distant despite her professionalism. There was something in her eyes that revealed an inner struggle. After all, standing before her was a childhood friend, someone who had shared moments of happiness and innocence with her, now in front of her in a way she could never have imagined. Marcos watched the movement in the courtroom, listening to the lawyers argue and present their cases, but it all felt far away. He couldn't focus, trapped in memories and questions. What is she thinking? Does she see me the same way everyone else here does? Does Anna think I'm guilty? He knew that, to her, he was probably just another case, just another person to judge. But at the same time, he held on to a fragile hope that she might see beyond the circumstances and recognize him for the man he was, or at least the man he used to be. As the hearing progressed, Anna found herself increasingly torn between her role and the memories that haunted her. Every time she looked at Marcos, it was as if he transformed back into the boy with the easy smile, her companion during all those afternoons playing soccer after school. She remembered how he'd run across their makeshift field in the park, always smiling, always full of dreams. The distant sound of the lawyers' arguments and the rhythmic bureaucracy of the trial became background noise to Anna. In her mind, reality blurred with the past. She recalled how they used to plan their futures when they were just teenagers, full of ambition and hope. "One day, I'm going to be someone important," he used to say with a sparkle in his eyes. "You'll see, Anna. I'll have a good job, a quiet life." Anna remembered the laughter, the plans, and all the conversations they had shared back then. At the time, it felt like the world was within their reach, that anything was possible. But now, looking at him sitting there, shoulders slumped and eyes downcast, she wondered where things had gone wrong for Marcos. Where was the boy who once believed he could change his own fate? Anna, as she read through the documents in front of her, struggled to suppress the whirlwind of emotions threatening to overtake her mind. Every word she had to utter to follow the courtroom procedures felt heavy, as if it betrayed not only their friendship, but a piece of who she was. Yet, duty demanded focus, and despite everything, she tried to comply. The silence broke when one of the defense attorneys requested the floor, forcing Anna to redirect her attention. Still, she couldn't help but notice that, beneath the formalities, everyone in the room seemed to see Marcos as just another defendant, a statistic amidst a sea of cases. Her heart sank at the thought that no one there knew Marcos's real story. No one understood how hard he had fought, how desperately he had tried to do the right thing despite the odds. For a fleeting moment, she wished she could set aside her title, stand up, and tell everyone in that room about the man he really was, or at least the man she once knew. Anna averted her gaze from Marcos, wondering what had happened during all those years she hadn't been a part of his life. What had changed since they'd gone their separate ways? Could life have pushed him into choices he never wanted to make? She knew how tough the world could be for people who grew up like they had, with so few opportunities and so many obstacles. But even so, it was hard to reconcile the boy she remembered with the man now accused of fraud. Marcos, on the other hand, was lost in his own memories. Seeing Anna there before him was a bittersweet blend of joy and shame. He couldn't remember the last time he had thought about her, but now he couldn't stop the flood of emotions she brought back. Part of him wanted to call out to her, to explain that he wasn't the man everyone thought he was, but the words caught in his throat. For a brief moment, Anna's gaze returned to him, and he thought he saw the girl she once was, hidden beneath the robe and the distant expression. A sharp pang of regret made him look away, unable to bear the weight of that moment. Does she feel the same way? He wondered, trying to imagine what was going through her mind as she looked at him. But before he could get lost any further in his thoughts, Anna's voice pulled him back to reality. "Let's continue," she said, her tone firm. Her words were a painful reminder that, in that courtroom, they weren't childhood friends anymore. She was the judge, and he was the defendant. Marcos straightened in his chair, feeling the weight of the cuffs on his wrists as the hearing went on. He couldn't help but wonder how things had come to this, how his life had spiraled to the point where his childhood friend was now the one presiding over his trial. There was something deeply unsettling about her gaze, as though it carried the remnants of dreams they had once shared. As the lawyers argued, evidence was presented, and murmurs filled the courtroom with each new revelation. The case felt routine to everyone else. But for Anna, it felt deeply personal, even though she fought to hide it. In moments of stillness, when no one was looking, her eyes would drift toward Marcos, and he could sense the silent pain she tried so hard to conceal. Maybe it was the weight of justice, or maybe it was the echoes of who they once were. Something inside Marcos broke. The stillness of the courtroom was suffocating, and he could no longer keep his emotions contained. His thoughts drifted back to a time when he believed his life would take a completely different path. He closed his eyes, trying to suppress the pain, but it was no use. Suddenly, Marcos's voice broke the silence. He couldn't stay quiet any longer, as if speaking was the only way to release the weight crushing him. "I never wanted you to see me like this, Anna." His words were low but carried a weight that seemed to fill the entire room. The reaction was immediate. Everyone turned to him in surprise. Anna froze, her hesitation betraying her carefully composed demeanor. For a moment, the roles of judge and defendant faded, leaving only two people, their shared history binding them in a fragile moment of vulnerability. Her expression hardened, as if trying to shield herself from the emotions he stirred. "Mr. Marcos, I ask that you maintain respect for this court," she said, her voice faltering slightly. Marcos took a deep breath, meeting her gaze directly. For the first time, his eyes held a truth that no one else in the room could see. There was immense sadness etched into his face, a pain that words couldn't fully convey. Yet, he tried, as if those words were all he had left. "I always tried to do the right thing, Anna." His voice cracked, and he lowered his eyes as if laying bare all his defenses. "I never thought my life would end up like this. I never wanted to be judged like this." Anna looked at him, her expression a mixture of compassion and duty. She knew she couldn't openly show what she felt or let her emotions dictate her decisions. But at the same time, it was impossible to ignore the humanity in Marcos, the story they had shared, the weight of what he was confessing. For a moment, the courtroom seemed to fade, leaving only the two of them. This wasn't just a trial. It was a silent goodbye to a friendship lost, a painful reunion with a past neither had expected to confront. Anna fought to regain her composure, but what she saw before her was more than a defendant. It was her friend, broken before her, desperate as though reaching for one final chance at redemption. "Mr. Marcos, this is not the time for personal statements," she said, more to herself than to him. She struggled to steady her voice, though her eyes betrayed her internal conflict. Marcos nodded silently, feeling as though he had said everything he could. He didn't expect his words to free him, but he needed Anna to see him as more than just the defendant everyone else saw. He was the boy she once knew, the one who had dreams and hope for a better life. And, in that fleeting moment, it felt like she understood, even if she couldn't say so aloud. As the courtroom returned to its rhythm, Anna's gaze occasionally lingered on Marcos. Beneath her professional demeanor, she felt his pain as if it were her own. Deep down, she knew this trial wasn't just about guilt or innocence. It was about a bond that still wasn't ready to be forgotten. The minutes dragged on, each one heavier than the last. The austere, formal atmosphere of the courtroom clashed with the intense emotions between Anna and Marcos, creating a palpable tension. Every glance they exchanged, every memory stirred, felt like waves crashing over them, carrying echoes of what once was and what might never be again. Anna tried to keep her focus, but her mind kept drifting to the past. She remembered afternoons when they'd sit on the school steps, dreaming about the future, imagining all they could achieve. Marcos had always been the optimist, the one who believed that no matter how hard life got, anything was possible. But now he was there, standing before her, caught in a system that made no distinction between innocence and appearances. To the court, he was just another man in prison clothes. Yet to Anna, he was still that boy with an easy smile and a generous heart, someone she never imagined would end up in such a situation. Marcos, on the other hand, remained still, but his eyes spoke volumes. He looked at Anna with a mix of sadness and regret, as if his gaze was trying to tell a story that no one else could understand. He wanted to tell her that he wasn't guilty, that he had tried in every way to make the right choices. But now, standing before his childhood friend, he felt stripped of all courage, left only with shame and the exhaustion of a relentless fight. When Anna lifted her gaze and met Marcos's again, she couldn't hide the flicker of pain that crossed her face. The connection between them was so strong, so visceral, that for a moment, the courtroom faded away. It was just the two of them, lost in a silent exchange of emotions and memories that no one else could grasp. He said nothing, but something in his eyes begged for understanding, for redemption. Anna felt her heart tighten, torn between her duty as a judge and her impulse as a friend. She wanted to scream that she understood, that she could see beyond the accusations, beyond the evidence and documents. But she knew that if she let emotion take over, she'd betray the very role she was meant to uphold. Even so, in that moment, she couldn't stop herself. A nearly inaudible whisper escaped her lips. "What happened to you, Marcos?" Marcos heard her, and his face twisted with pain. He knew her question was deeper than it seemed, filled with both sadness and disappointment. He didn't have a simple answer. How could he explain all the twists and turns, all the hard choices, all the doors that had slammed shut? He looked away, unable to bear the pain reflected in her eyes. Anna noticed his reaction and tried to pull herself together, reminding herself of the role she needed to play. She took a deep breath and focused back on the documents in front of her, struggling to maintain her neutrality. She knew that as a judge, it was her responsibility to remain fair, to consider only the evidence, and that allowing her emotions to sway her decisions would betray the trust placed in her. But at the same time, she knew there was a story between them that couldn't be ignored. Even if unspoken, that silent story filled every corner of the room, and she felt its weight pressing down on her shoulders. When the session was adjourned for a brief recess, Anna took the opportunity to step away, retreating to a private room where she could breathe. Alone, she closed her eyes and let silent tears fall as she tried to cope with the pain of seeing a friend in such a situation. What she feared most was that behind all the formality lay a painful truth, that she, unwillingly, would have to decide the fate of someone who had once been an important part of her life. After a few minutes, Anna composed herself, wiped her tears, and took a deep breath, determined to resume the trial. Yet as she returned to the courtroom, she felt different, as though something inside her was on the verge of change. Anna walked back into the courtroom, the weight of her emotions balanced precariously in her chest. She knew she needed focus, that she couldn't let herself be swayed by a friendship that, as meaningful as it was, couldn't interfere with her duties as a judge. Yet every step back to her seat felt like an immense effort. The image of Marcos's face, vulnerable, seeking understanding, was etched into her mind. She sat down, adjusted her robe, and took a moment to recompose herself. The court reconvened, and everyone returned to their places. The atmosphere in the room seemed heavier, as though everyone sensed that this was no ordinary trial. Marcos's case had somehow become more than a simple fraud trial. It had become a symbol of something Anna could no longer ignore. The lawyers began presenting their closing arguments, and the evidence was scrutinized once more. Anna's eyes remained focused on the papers before her, but her mind was elsewhere, her thoughts once again consumed by Marcos. She forced herself to concentrate, to examine the evidence, but the image of her friend, who had once been her equal and was now sitting as a defendant, wouldn't leave her mind. Marcos, for his part, sat in a near catatonic state. He barely registered what was happening around him. He felt like a spectator to his own life, powerless against a fate that seemed already sealed. His body was there, but his mind was adrift in a storm of emotions. His greatest fear was that by the end of the day, there would be no hope left for him. He was no longer the man of dreams and aspirations Anna once knew. Now, he was the man the world saw, guilty, lost. Anna felt Marcos's gaze on her, but tried not to succumb to its weight. What she wanted most was to apologize, to tell him she understood his pain, but she couldn't. She knew she couldn't let her emotions interfere with the trial. Yet, deep down, there was a war raging within her, a constant battle between justice and humanity. The defense attorney requested the floor. He spoke eloquently, arguing that his client was not guilty of the charges, that the evidence was circumstantial, and that nothing concrete had been presented to prove his guilt. He made a compelling case, and the court seemed to follow his reasoning. But Judge Anna felt that no matter how well-chosen the words were, they couldn't erase the guilt she felt inside for being part of a system that often judged without seeing the true story. Anna closed her eyes for a moment, trying to shake off the weight she felt. When she opened them again, she felt the gravity of the decision she was about to make. The words she would soon speak could not be taken back. The courtroom, the lawyers, the audience, they were all waiting for something final. She had to be firm, objective. Yet something inside her still resisted. It was the memory of Marcos, the friendship she didn't want to lose. How could she be impartial when the man she once knew so well sat before her as a defendant? How could she ignore the person he had been and consider only the accusations before her? What if all he needed was a second chance? Anna knew she couldn't make the decision alone. Her role was to uphold the law, but something deep within her whispered that justice wasn't solely about rules. Marcos's life was in her hands, and she felt as if it was impossible to make this decision without seeing beyond the law. "Ladies and gentlemen," Anna said, her voice steady, but her heart in turmoil, "this hearing is adjourned. I will deliberate on the case and announce my decision shortly." The room was utterly silent. Anna stood and glanced one last time at Marcos. He sat there, head down, his gaze lost, and for the first time in a long while, she felt he was no longer the man she had known, but someone she still wanted to save, if only she could. The courtroom emptied, leaving Judge Anna seated at her bench, staring down at the papers before her. Her thoughts lingered on Marcos, the childhood friend who now stood accused before her. Life, she thought, could be heartbreakingly cruel, tearing apart paths that once ran side by side. Deep down, Anna knew that the judgment she would pass would not just be another courtroom ruling. It would follow her, a weight she might never be able to put down. Back in her office, Anna wrestled with her thoughts. The courtroom was silent now, but her mind wasn't. The weight of her impending decision pressed down harder with every passing second. The documents in front of her were a stark reminder of the chasm between the law and the human heart. Marcos, her friend, stood at the mercy of her ruling, and she struggled to reconcile fairness with compassion. She walked to the window, gazing out at the bustling city below. Life outside carried on as usual, but within her, time seemed frozen. Every thought, every memory, deepened her turmoil. How could she embody the impartiality her role demanded when her heart was so entangled? How could she judge a man who, in her heart, was still the boy she had shared countless memories with? The image of Marcos sitting in the courtroom was burned into her mind. She couldn't forget the way he had looked at her, pleading silently, not just for innocence, but for something deeper. Perhaps he sought recognition, the hope that someone, anyone, still saw him for who he truly was. The burden of holding his fate in her hands grew heavier by the moment. She sat back at her desk and picked up Marcos's case file. The evidence was clear and neatly presented, but it all felt hollow. The accusations of fraud and the supporting documents spoke to his actions, but they said nothing of his character. Nothing about the man she once knew. A knock on the door broke her thoughts. Anna looked up. It was the courtroom clerk, his face drawn with tension. "Judge Anna, Mr. Marcos is asked to speak with you," he said, his tone cautious, as if he sensed the enormity of the situation. Anna hesitated. She knew he wanted to explain, to apologize, or maybe just to reconnect. But would speaking to him bring clarity or only deepen her inner conflict? She glanced down at the papers once more and realized she needed to hear him out. Perhaps, in his words, she might find the resolution she desperately sought. "Let him in," she replied, her voice steady, masking her uncertainty. The clerk stepped out, and moments later, Marcos entered. He looked thinner, wearier, but his eyes still carried a glimmer of hope, faint but undeniable. He closed the door softly behind him, lingering near the entrance, as if unsure of how to proceed. For a moment, Anna just looked at him. What stood before her wasn't just a defendant, but a friend whose expression still carried the echoes of shared laughter and dreams from long ago. "Marcos," Anna finally said, her voice quiet but heavy with meaning. "What do you want to say to me?" Marcos stepped forward but hesitated again, his words caught in his throat. "I know you can't change what's already happened," he began, his voice strained with remorse. "I know I'm responsible for a lot of things. But, Anna, that's not who I am. You know my story. You don't see me the way everyone else does. Please just remember that." There was a rawness in his words, a sincerity that tugged at Anna's defenses. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to see beyond the charges, beyond the courtroom. "Marcos," Anna said, her voice trembling, "I know who you were. I know what you've been through. But my duty is to deliver justice. I can't let my feelings cloud that responsibility. It wouldn't be right." Marcos lowered his head, his shoulders sagging under a weight that seemed unbearable. "I understand, Anna. I do. But if you could just remember who I was, who we were, don't let the system decide who I am now." Anna's chest tightened. His plea wasn't just for a lighter sentence, it was for acknowledgement. He didn't want to be reduced to a case file, to a defendant. He wanted to be seen. She closed her eyes briefly, fighting the storm of emotions within her. When she opened them again, she no longer saw an accused man. She saw her friend. A knock interrupted the moment. Anna stood, her resolve wavering but her sense of duty firm. The time for deliberation was drawing to a close. Returning to the courtroom, Anna's footsteps echoed in the stillness. The weight of the decision bore down on her with every step. She had faced countless cases in her career, but none had ever felt this personal, this fraught. The line between justice and emotion had never been so blurred. As she entered, the room fell silent. All eyes turned to her, the prosecution, the defense, the few observers. The air was thick with anticipation. Anna sat down, her hands resting on the papers before her. The evidence was clear, but it wasn't the whole truth. How could she sentence Marcos without acknowledging the man she knew, the life he had lived? She looked up at Marcos. He sat hunched, his gaze fixed on the floor. He had said all he could. Now, everything rested on her shoulders. Taking a deep breath, Anna prepared to speak. Whatever decision she made, it wouldn't just define his future. It would define hers. The room grew even quieter as she raised her head and spoke, her voice firm but trembling, as though the words had to fight their way through an internal struggle to emerge. This court exists to judge facts, and the facts are clear. The evidence, though inconclusive, points to the possibility of the defendant's guilt. However, justice is not merely about assessing evidence. It is also about understanding the circumstances surrounding each individual, each life. She paused, the weight of her words heavy in her mind, as she felt all eyes fixed on her. When she glanced at Marcos, something inside her fractured. She remembered him as a young man, full of dreams and innocence. It didn't feel right that he should pay for what he hadn't done, or at least for what she believed he hadn't done. Yet she couldn't ignore the fact that the system was built on rules, and those rules left no room for emotions. Considering the defendant's background, the testimonies, and the evidence, this court finds itself in a challenging position. Mr. Marcos Silva stands accused of fraud. The evidence is insufficient for a definitive conviction. However, this court cannot overlook the circumstances that brought him here. She looked at Marcos again. He was no longer meeting her gaze. His eyes seemed distant, as if he already knew what was coming. Anna closed her eyes briefly, trying to find an answer, a way to lighten the burden of the decision she knew was inevitable. However, she continued, her voice steadier now. As the reality of her judgment took shape, the court considers the remorse demonstrated by the defendant and the context in which these actions occurred. Mr. Marcos Silva will not be convicted of fraud, but he will be held accountable for his involvement in illegal activities that, while not proven unequivocally, cannot be ignored. Anna took a deep breath, the silence in the courtroom absolute. She knew her decision wasn't a full acquittal, but neither was it a total condemnation. Marcos wouldn't walk away completely free of the charges, but he would have a chance to rebuild his life, to seek redemption. Mr. Marcos Silva, she declared, is hereby sentenced to 2 years of house arrest under supervised monitoring, with mandatory community service and participation in social reintegration programs. Considering mitigating factors and the potential for rehabilitation, his sentence will be reviewed after this period. She paused for a long moment, her eyes fixed on Marcos. She knew he had hoped for more. She, too, wished for more for him, but the limitations of justice wouldn't allow it. Still, she knew he had been given a chance to reclaim his life, and that was the best she could offer. She couldn't overturn what the system dictated, but she had granted him an opportunity to start anew. "This session is adjourned," she said, her voice quieter now. It was a difficult judgment, but it was the only one she believed to be just. The murmurs began immediately. Lawyers moved forward, but before anyone could say a word, Marcos lifted his eyes to meet Anna's. She saw a mix of emotions on his face: relief, sadness, and perhaps, for the first time in a long while, a spark of hope. He wasn't free, but he wasn't defeated. In that moment, it felt like enough. As he was escorted out of the courtroom, Anna sat back down, her shoulders heavy yet relieved. Knowing she had made the decision she felt was closest to true justice. She knew the road ahead would be difficult for both of them, but at least she had given him something that many never received: a chance. Anna looked out the window once more, feeling the fresh breeze drift into the room. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, justice was something more than simply applying the law. She had done what she could, and in some way, it brought her peace. The days following the sentence were an emotional whirlwind for everyone involved. For Marcos, the relief of knowing his punishment wasn't as harsh as he feared was tempered by guilt and shame. He still didn't know how to rebuild the trust of those around him, especially Anna. She had given him a chance, but how could he prove himself worthy of it? Marcos returned home to begin his house arrest. While less severe than prison, it still represented a form of confinement. He had grown accustomed to a freer lifestyle, but now he faced long days within the limits of his own space, with only his thoughts for company. Community service and therapy sessions were mandatory. Rehabilitation started there, though he had no idea what lay ahead. Anna, on the other hand, tried to resume her routine. The weight of her decision lingered. Though she knew she had followed the law, something inside her wondered if she had done more than that. She couldn't go back. Marcos's fate was sealed, but her choices had brought her to a more challenging place, where the professional and personal were deeply intertwined. She spent sleepless nights revisiting the case, trying to quiet the thoughts that haunted her, but she knew she couldn't avoid confronting her feelings forever. Marcos remained on her mind, and more than ever, she felt compelled to follow his progress, not out of friendship, but out of hope that he truly could rebuild himself. One afternoon, Anna decided to visit Marcos. It was an unexpected, perhaps impulsive, gesture, but she couldn't ignore the pull to see him. She knew he was serving his sentence, and while the legal process was over, she wanted to know if he was genuinely willing to change. When she reached his door, she hesitated for a moment. The last time she'd been there, the circumstances had been vastly different. She knew Marcos now bore not just the weight of his mistakes, but also the pain of regret. She pressed the doorbell and waited, the seconds stretching out until the door opened. Marcos stood there, unshaven and with tired eyes. When he saw her, he gave a faint but genuine smile, as if surprised and relieved at the same time. "Anna," he said softly, his voice unsure. "Hi, Marcos," she replied, trying to mask her own unease. "How are you doing?" He stepped aside, inviting her in. Anna entered, and they sat in the modest living room. The space was simple but comfortable. Marcos seemed more uneasy than usual, perhaps because of her presence, perhaps because of the weight of the situation. "I've been following your community service work," Anna said, breaking the silence. "How's it going?" Marcos sighed and settled into the couch. "It's been hard, but I understand it's necessary. I'm trying, Anna. You know, house arrest is nothing compared to what I did. I know that. No matter what others say, I know who I am. And deep down, I'm not running from anything. I need to understand myself first. That's why I'm doing this. For me." Anna watched him, her heart heavy, but also somewhat relieved. Marcos was being honest with himself, something she wasn't sure he'd be able to do when the case first started. "And what about therapy?" she asked with a small smile, trying to ease the conversation. Marcos let out a low laugh, almost humorless. "I'm a terrible patient, you know that. But yeah, I'm going. It won't be easy, Anna. But I think, deep down, it's what I need to understand how I ended up here." Anna nodded. The conversation felt more comfortable now, but something still hung in the air, an uncertainty neither of them could shake. She knew she couldn't solve Marcos's life for him, that he still had a long journey ahead, but at that moment, she felt he was on the right path. He was facing the problem head-on, and to her, that meant there was a chance. "It doesn't have to be perfect, Marcos," Anna said gently. "You just need to try. And I know you have the strength to do it." He looked at her, his eyes shining with an emotion she couldn't quite identify. Maybe gratitude, maybe something deeper, but she knew it wasn't just about the mistake he'd made anymore. It was about a chance to rebuild, to rise again. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Anna," he said, his voice lower, but filled with a sincerity that touched her heart. She fell silent for a moment, the words stuck in her throat. She didn't know how to respond because the truth was, he had become more than just a defendant to her. Marcos, the childhood friend, the man she once knew, was now someone she saw in a completely different light. The decision she had made wasn't just a matter of the law. It was a choice between who he was and who he could become. Anna knew that, for both of them, this encounter wouldn't resolve everything, but it represented a beginning. Not the end, but the start of something that, for her, still seemed an uncertain path, but one full of possibilities. She felt that, perhaps, in this visit, she was also taking a step toward her own truth, and that this step, though small, might be the first of many. When she stood up to leave, Marcos followed her to the door, and before she stepped out, he looked at her one last time, as if he wanted to say something, but the words got stuck in his throat. "I'll do my best, Anna. I promise," he said, with a conviction he'd never shown before. Anna smiled, a hint of hope in her eyes. "I know you will, Marcos. I know." She stepped out the door, and as she closed it behind her, she felt that something had changed. Not just in him, but in her too. The road ahead would still be long for both of them, but in the end, there was one thing she knew for sure. True justice isn't just about a sentence. It's built over time, through choices, and most importantly, through forgiveness. The following months passed slowly, but steadily. Marcos's life wasn't easy, but he was starting to find ways to cope with his new daily routine. House arrest, though limiting, wasn't the worst prison he faced. The real prison was in his mind, the constant battle between regret and hope. He knew it wouldn't be quick or simple, but every small step felt like a victory. He continued with his community service and therapy sessions. Gradually, the pain and shame gave way to something more tangible, a desire to change. Even though every day he had to face his flaws, he felt that, over time, he could earn back his life. The conversations with the therapist, discussing the wrong choices that led him here, were starting to have an impact. But despite all of that, he knew that real change would only come if he could forgive himself. Anna, on her part, continued to follow Marcos's progress, never intruding into his space. She knew she couldn't become a constant pillar in his life, but she wanted to make sure he had the resources and help he needed to take the first steps out of his situation. Sometimes, she caught herself wondering if she was doing enough. As a judge, she had already done her part, but as a friend, what more could she do? The answer to that question came on a rainy afternoon when Anna decided to pay Marcos a surprise visit. She knew he was at home, serving another day of his sentence, and after weeks of distance, she felt it was time to see firsthand how he was truly coping with the situation. Something inside her urged her to go, to see if the decision she made was actually helping, if he was finding the redemption everyone expected from him. When she arrived at Marcos's door, the rain was still coming down hard, but the sound of her footsteps echoed down the empty hallway until she reached his house. She rang the bell, and he answered right away, his expression surprised and cautious. When he saw her, a faint smile appeared on his face, but it was quickly replaced with a look of uncertainty. He knew that Anna's visit, though expected, meant much more than just a casual check-in. It was a chance for him to show he was changing. "Hi, Anna," Marcos said, his voice soft, but full of expectation. What are you doing here?" She smiled, trying to ease the tension in the air. "I just wanted to see how you're doing. I'm not a judge here anymore, Marcos. Just a friend, checking if you're on the right path." He motioned for her to come in, and as she stepped inside, Anna noticed that the house was tidier than it had been the last few times. It wasn't much, but it was something. Marcos was trying, making an effort, and that touched Anna deeply. They sat on the couch, and as they talked, she noticed how much he had changed. His tone was calmer, his words more measured. There was no longer that sense of desperation, that need to justify himself. He was accepting his journey with everything it had, and that, in a way, brought her peace. "I'm trying, Anna," Marcos said sincerely, looking her in the eyes. "I know there's no going back. I know I can't erase what I did. But all I want now is to be able to look in the mirror and see that I'm a better person. That's what keeps me going." Anna felt a lump in her throat, but the smile she gave was genuine. She felt proud of him, more than she ever thought possible, and as hard as it was, she knew she was seeing someone standing tall again. That's what she wanted, for him to find his own way, away from the shadows of the past. "You're doing well, Marcos," she said firmly. "I know it feels like a long road, but you're heading in the right direction." He lowered his head, perhaps in gratitude, maybe because he still felt he had much to prove, but there was something in his posture that showed he was ready to move forward. It wasn't a miraculous change, but a slow and patient one. They spent the afternoon talking about life, what was to come, and even reminiscing about the old days when they'd play soccer and dream of a different future. The nostalgia lingered in the air, but without bitterness. That past no longer weighed them down, and the memories, though distant, now seemed like an important part of who they were. Before leaving, Anna looked at him one last time, a calm smile on her face. "Keep it up, Marcos. You're doing the right thing." He smiled, and for the first time in a long while, he seemed at peace with himself. "I will, Anna. I promise. Thank you for believing in me." She left his house, the rain still falling, but feeling that the visit had been a milestone. It wasn't an ending, but a turning point. Anna knew that Marcos still had challenges ahead, but she also knew he had already done the hardest part. He had started. At that moment, she felt that justice, though difficult and often unyielding, could also be a tool for transformation. And perhaps that was what truly mattered: the ability to start over, to learn from mistakes, and most of all, to find redemption, not in a courtroom, but within oneself. Hope, after all, lies in the little things. And as Anna now knew, Marcos's journey was just beginning. That visit to Marcos, though brief, left Anna with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. Something inside her seemed to have calmed, as if the choice she made months ago had finally found its way. She knew Marcos's rehabilitation was far from over, but she had already seen progress. And to her, that was a clear sign that justice, in some way, had fulfilled its purpose. But Anna's world in the courtroom didn't stop. There were new cases, new decisions, new challenges every day. The routine of being a judge, with all its complexities and responsibilities, demanded that she refocus on what was ahead. But somewhere in her mind, Marcos was always present, with his promise of change and his effort to reclaim himself. It was on one of those days, when Anna was preparing for a new session in court, that she was surprised by an unexpected message. It was from Marcos. The text was simple, but filled with an emotion she never expected. "Anna, I did it. We did it. I got a job. It's not much, but it's a start. I wanted you to know because you were the first person to believe in me. Thank you for giving me that chance." Anna's heart tightened as she read those words. She knew how much this meant to him. Marcos hadn't just changed his own life. He had taken the first step toward reintegrating into society, to reclaiming the dignity he thought he had lost. And he wanted her to know that message wasn't just an update. It was Marcos sharing with her his small but significant victory. The day after receiving the message, Anna was faced with a case she couldn't ignore. A case she had heard about from colleagues was now on her desk, a sentence review. The defendant, who had served part of his sentence, was seeking a reduction based on his good behavior and rehabilitation efforts. As she reviewed the case, Anna noticed something peculiar. The defendant was someone she knew well. Marcos had decided to file for sentence review. When Anna found Marcos's name among the piles of papers, a sense of discomfort washed over her. She knew that, as much as she wanted him to succeed, her position as a judge put her in a delicate situation. She couldn't be the one to decide his fate again. Court rules were clear. The sentence review had to be based on facts, not personal feelings. What she felt for Marcos, her friendship with him, could not interfere with the decision. Anna faced a dilemma. How could she be fair to someone who, no matter how deserving, was being judged by the same standards as all the other defendants? She knew Marcos had shown remorse, but the truth was, he was still paying for the mistakes of his past. The weight of the decision rested on her, and she felt the pressure to make the right choice. Over the next week, Anna reviewed the case again and again. She spoke to other judges and examined Marcos's records. The pressure was mounting, and she still didn't know what to do. The evidence was there. Marcos had followed all the recommendations, completed community service, attended therapy, and even managed to get a job. He was clearly trying to do the right thing. But still, there was the risk that it might seem like he was receiving special treatment. To her, that was a fine, dangerous line. Finally, the day of the hearing arrived. Anna entered the courtroom with the same composed demeanor she always had, but when she looked at Marcos, something tightened in her chest. He was there again, his hands nervously folded on the table. He looked at her with a silent expectation, but Anna could see in his eyes the same hope he had when he first showed up at his trial. He wasn't there to be saved, but to be heard. When the session began, Anna presented the case objectively. She spoke about Marcos's efforts, his rehabilitation, and the challenges he had faced. She also spoke about the steps he had taken to reintegrate into society. However, as she spoke, Anna felt something deep inside that she couldn't deny. Her role as a judge was being fulfilled, but her humanity was being tested with every word she spoke. When it was Marcos's turn to speak, he stood up, and his voice, though calm, carried a weight he had never shown before. He looked at Anna, and for a moment, their eyes met. There was something in his eyes that said more than words could express. He was there not just as a defendant, but as a man who knew his life had changed. "Anna," he began, his voice a little shaky, but steady. "I'm not asking to be free. I'm not the man I was when I came in here. I know I was wrong, and I don't expect to be forgiven for everything. What I'm asking for is a chance to live again, to be the man I can be, to prove that things can be different." Anna closed her eyes for a brief moment, allowing herself to feel the weight of Marcos's words. She knew how hard he had fought for this, and she knew he wasn't completely free from his past. But what she also knew was that he was willing to keep fighting. And that, to her, meant more than any legal argument. When she finally spoke, her voice was firm, but filled with understanding. "The court recognizes your efforts, Marcos. It recognizes your struggle to change. Your sentence will be reduced by 1 year on the condition that you continue psychological counseling and community service. It's not the end, but a new beginning. Marcos looked at her, his eyes misty, but shining with a gratitude she couldn't describe. He knew the decision wasn't everything he wanted, but it was the chance he needed. He was being seen, not as a man condemned, but as someone capable of starting over. As she left the courtroom, Anna felt that, while justice was a tool that often seemed unforgiving, it also had the power to transform. She hadn't given Marcos everything he wanted, but she had given him what he needed, the chance to prove that change was possible. And to her, that was enough. The decision had been made, and Marcos now had the chance he had long sought. But despite the reduction in his sentence, something still weighed on Anna. She knew that this moment of justice was only the beginning of a long journey, but she couldn't shake the weight of her responsibility. Marcos, leaving the courtroom, stopped for a moment in front of the doors, as if still absorbing the reality of it. He knew this was an opportunity many would never get, and the fact that it was him, someone with his past, receiving this chance, almost felt surreal. The weight of Anna's decision was on him, but at the same time, he felt he could walk with his head held high, no longer haunted by the ghosts of his past. He had a long road ahead, and he knew it. Anna watched from the bench, but inside, she was deeply moved. She knew the decision could be seen in many ways, and she herself questioned whether she had been impartial enough. To her, the biggest dilemma wasn't the punishment, but the system that applied it. What did true justice mean? Was it simply following the cold letter of the law, or was it about trying to understand the person behind the crime? She wanted to believe there was room for humanity in the sentence. She left the courtroom and went home with a full mind, thoughts swirling. Sitting on the couch in her apartment, she picked up her phone and sent Marcos a message, unsure if he would respond right away. The text was simple. "I hope this opportunity makes sense to you, Marcos. Keep going, okay?" She closed her phone and sat there, alone with her thoughts, trying to understand what the future held for the man she had known so many years ago. She knew he wasn't completely free of the chains of the past, but she also knew he had done something few would do. He had begun working for his redemption. Now, it was up to him to decide if he would keep his promise. Meanwhile, Marcos was at home, reflecting on what had just happened. He couldn't believe that hearing had truly been a new beginning. He knew that, somehow, he needed to show Anna he deserved this chance. Not to please her, but to prove to himself that there was still something good inside him. The fight wasn't over. He had a job, but he was still far from rebuilding his life completely. The fear of failing to keep his promises weighed heavily on him, but what really terrified him was the fear of failing again, of losing himself in old choices. However, there was something new now. He felt like he was receiving a second chance, not just from the justice system, but from his own conscience. He had never truly felt he had changed, but now, with this opportunity, he knew he had to seize it fully. He no longer wanted to be the man the past had shaped him into. He wanted to be someone who could look back and honestly say, "I tried. I did everything I could." Days later, he met with his therapist, who, with a smile, gave him some good news. He was beginning to show signs of real change. During their sessions, he had started to open up more, talking about his regrets more clearly. Now, he knew that to move forward, he first needed to reconcile with his past. The therapist suggested he write a letter, something that would help him close the painful chapters of his life. The idea of writing a letter seemed simple, but Marcos knew it would be a challenge. He grabbed a blank sheet of paper and, hesitantly, began to write. The words flowed more easily than he had expected, as if he was finally freeing what he had kept inside for so long. When he finished the letter, he felt a lightness he hadn't known in years. The letter wouldn't change his past, but it was an essential step for him, a symbolic gesture that he was ready to live with the weight of what he had done, but not be defined by it. After the session with his therapist, Marcos went to his new job. It wasn't anything glamorous, but to him, it meant everything. He had been hired as a maintenance assistant at a small hardware store, nothing fancy, but it required him to be responsible, show up on time, and commit. It was a modest start, but a genuine one. Each day, As he returned home after his shift, he felt closer to becoming the man he wanted to be. That job, that simple routine, were the building blocks of his personal rebuilding. Anna, on the other hand, continued her life in the courtroom, but more and more, she found herself questioning if she had made the right choice. No matter how hard she tried to separate her friendship from her role as a judge, there was something there, a connection she couldn't ignore. She wasn't convinced that her decision had been easy, but she knew it was what he needed at that moment. She returned to court with a lighter heart, but a weight in her stomach, always thinking of Marcos and what he might do from that point on. In her mind, one question kept repeating: will he really change? Or is this just a phase? She could only hope that, in the end, he would prove to himself that, like so many others, he too had the right to start over. The following months brought with them an increasingly stable routine for Marcos. Every morning, he woke up early, put on his uniform, and headed to work with a sense of duty. The environment at the hardware store was simple and, in a way, peaceful, but he knew it was a great opportunity to prove to himself that he could be more than his past suggested. Marcos didn't have many close friends there, but the interaction with his colleagues was enough for him to begin rebuilding his sense of belonging. However, there was something that bothered him. Despite all his efforts to move forward, he knew that his rehabilitation was being observed by many. The weight of his past was always present, like a shadow he tried to shake off, but sometimes it felt closer than he wanted it to be. He could feel the discreet glances of others, the conversations that stopped when he approached. He knew that the mistakes of his past were something few could forget. But he also knew there was nothing he could do other than keep moving forward. One afternoon, after his shift, Marcos sat in his small room, the letter he had written to his past still on the table. He had read and reread those words so many times that they felt like part of him. But something was missing. He knew he couldn't close that chapter without taking one more important step. He needed to go see Anna. Not to ask for forgiveness, but to thank her. To show her that what she had done had not been in vain, that he was truly trying. He grabbed the letter and decided today would be the day. He didn't know how she would react, or even if she'd be available, but he had to do this. It was more than a need. It was a way to thank the woman who, at some point, believed he still had a chance. Anna was at her desk in the courtroom, absorbed in her daily cases, when her phone buzzed. It was a message from Marcos, simple but full of meaning. "Anna, can I meet you? I have something important to tell you." She paused for a moment, staring at the screen. Something tightened in her chest, a mix of anticipation and concern. For a second, she wondered if he was about to say he had failed. But she knew that wasn't the kind of person he wanted to be anymore. So, with a sigh, she replied, "Sure, Marcos. Let's meet." Where? After agreeing on the location, they met at a small cafe downtown. It was a simple place, but peaceful, a refuge for conversations and encounters. When Marcos entered, Anna was already waiting for him. He seemed calmer than the last time she had seen him, his expression more serene, more confident. But at the same time, his eyes still carried the weight of the life he was trying to rebuild. Marcos approached Anna with a shy smile, almost as if still unsure of how she would react. "Hey, Anna," he said, sitting down at the table. "I really want to thank you for everything and for giving me the chance to show that I can be better. I know I can't change what I did, but I'm trying. And you were the first person who saw that before anyone else. I wrote a letter. I know it might sound strange, but I felt like I had to do this. I need to show you who I am now, not who I was." Anna looked at him in silence, feeling an overwhelming surge of emotion. She had never imagined he could be so sincere in his words, so open. Marcos's expression, genuine and vulnerable, touched her deeply. "Marcos," she began softly, "you've already shown me what I needed to see. I gave you a chance, but the decision to change was yours. And that's what matters most." He smiled, but it was a nostalgic smile, as if gratitude and pain were mixed in his heart. "I know. I just wanted you to know that I'm not doing this just for me. I want to show everyone that there's something good in me, that I can be different, that I can do things the right way." Even if it takes time, I'll make it. Anna was silent for a moment, watching him closely. She didn't know exactly what he needed to hear, but she knew he was saying the right words. She simply looked into his eyes and said, "Don't be so hard on yourself, Marcos. The road isn't easy, and there will be tough days. But the important thing is that you're heading in the right direction. And that's already a big start." Marcos took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words. Sometimes, it felt like he was still carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. But there, with Anna, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he could start living without that burden. "I don't know what the future holds, Anna, but I'm more certain than ever that I can be better. And that I want to be better. Not to impress anyone, but for myself." She smiled, feeling a peace she hadn't felt in a long time. She knew Marcos was doing the right thing, but she also knew that his real battle would be internal. He would have to learn to live with the mistakes of his past, but at the same time, he would have to learn to forgive himself. That wouldn't happen overnight, but he was willing to try. "I believe in you, Marcos. And I know you'll keep proving it every day. What you're doing now, that's more than I could have hoped for." They talked for a while longer about life, work, and daily challenges. For Marcos, that meeting was more than just a simple conversation. It was a validation of his journey, a reminder that change was possible, no matter how hard it was. At the end of the meeting, Marcos stood up, looking at Anna with a sincere gaze. "Thank you, Anna. Not just for today, but for everything. I'll keep moving forward. No matter what happens, I'll keep going." Anna stood up as well, feeling that, in some way, she too had found closure for something that had been bothering her for months. She knew Marcos had a long road ahead, but at that moment, she felt like he wasn't alone anymore. He had her support, and maybe more importantly, he had begun to believe in himself. They said goodbye with a brief but meaningful hug, and as Anna left the cafe, she felt a slight relief. She knew Marcos still had many obstacles to face, but she was convinced of one thing: he had taken the first step. And to her, that was all that mattered. As time went on, each day seemed like a new challenge for Marcos. While his routine at work was quieter, he still felt the judgmental stares lingering over him. But they weren't as heavy as before. The truth was, he was starting to realize that most of the pressure came from himself. He was learning to deal with it little by little, and that, for him, was already a big step. Despite this, insecurity still visited him in his loneliest moments. He spent sleepless nights replaying his past choices, the decisions that had led him to this point. No matter how hard he tried to convince himself that he had changed, a part of him still questioned whether it was really possible to forget everything he had done. The weight of regret wasn't something he could just brush aside. Still, he remembered Anna's words from the cafe. She believed in him, and for some reason that faith in his change was beginning to have a deep impact on him. It was during one of these nights of reflection that he decided to take action. He needed to confront what troubled him, to stop hiding from what he had done. Deep down, he knew what bothered him wasn't the judgment of others anymore, but the fear that he might never become the person he wanted to be. Marcos knew the road ahead was still full of obstacles, but he was more determined than ever to face them. He no longer wanted to be the person others saw, but the person he knew he could be. With this thought in mind, he made an important decision. He was going to look into a social reintegration program. He knew this was a rare opportunity, but it could be exactly what he needed. For him, reintegration meant more than just a job or a chance to restart his life. It was a way to show himself that he was no longer at the mercy of his mistakes. He really wanted to turn his life around, and to do so, he knew he would need help and to move forward with everything he had to offer. There was no room left for hesitation. The next day, after finishing his shift at the hardware store, he headed to the Social Services Center. It was a small, modest place, but it was well known for offering support and rehabilitation programs for former inmates. He introduced himself, explained his situation, and by the end of the visit, he signed up for the reintegration program. The process wouldn't be quick, but he felt like he was on the right path. With a lighter heart, Marcos left the center. As he walked through the streets, something inside him seemed to finally calm down. He knew that, at that moment, He was doing something for himself, something no one else could do for him. This was his journey, and he was ready to keep going. When he got home, he found a letter from Anna. She had sent it without any special reason, just to stay in touch. The simple gesture moved Marcos deeply. She didn't have to do this, but she knew how much he needed support. He opened the letter and read her words carefully. "Marcos, I know you have a long road ahead, but I want you to know that I'm rooting for you. I believe in your ability to transform. Sometimes, the biggest challenge isn't others but ourselves. You've already taken an important step by wanting to change. Now move forward with confidence. Don't give up. Believe in yourself, just as I believe in you." Marcos closed his eyes for a moment. He'd never imagined receiving words like this, especially from someone who knew his past so well. She believed in him, truly. That gave him strength to keep going, even in the hardest times. The following days were marked by subtle but important changes. Marcos began to feel that the reintegration program was really providing him with the tools he needed to regain his dignity. The sessions with the social workers were challenging, but he was learning to deal with his guilt in a healthier way. He became more and more involved in the activities, trying to improve his skills, find new interests, and, above all, learn how to handle the mistakes of his past in a constructive way. But, as he well knew, the biggest obstacle was still ahead: society's judgment. Even though doors were opening for him on his internal journey, he knew the outside world wouldn't always be as welcoming. The chances of encountering discrimination and mistrust were high, and he would need to prove not only to others, but also to himself, that the man he wanted to be was not a prisoner of his past. And it was this internal struggle that truly consumed him. However, Marcos was no longer alone in this fight. He could feel Anna's silent support, her words echoing in his mind. She believed he could change. And with that belief, he believed it too. Meanwhile, Anna continued her work at the courthouse, but something inside her had changed. She often thought of Marcos and the impact her decision had on him. She knew he still faced many challenges, but for some reason, she no longer doubted that he was on the right path. Maybe it was because he was starting to face his mistakes so honestly. Maybe it was the way he seemed determined to rebuild himself, piece by piece, without surrendering to the past. Whatever the reason, she felt that, in some way, he was surpassing everything that had once marked him. One afternoon, Anna received an unexpected call from Marcos. She smiled when she heard his voice. "Anna, I wanted to thank you again. I'm doing well. More than well. You were right, I needed to start with something small. And that's exactly what I did. I'm learning to be a different person. Not for you, but for myself." She listened to his words, feeling a peaceful satisfaction in her heart. She knew it was still early to say he was completely redeemed, but that moment of recognition, of humility on his part, was a sign that he was heading in the right direction. "I always knew you could do it, Marcos. You're doing the right thing. Keep going, don't look back. I'll be rooting for you." And with those words, she ended the call. But as she looked out the window of her office, Anna felt a peace she hadn't felt in a long time. She knew Marcos still had a lot to learn, but the simple fact that he was trying, that he was seeking to improve, was more than she could have hoped for. Marcos had begun his journey of redemption, and even though the future was uncertain, he knew the important thing was to keep moving forward. Marcos was beginning to adjust to his new routine. His days were marked by discipline, by his classes in the reintegration program, and by his job at the hardware store. He still felt the constant internal battle against the shadow of his past, but there was something inside him keeping him steady, the idea that he had control over his future. Something that, just a few months ago, seemed unthinkable. However, the routine started to be interrupted by small signs of change. He was invited to an event organized by the reintegration program, a sort of gathering where people in recovery could share their stories and progress. Marcos wasn't exactly sure what to expect from the event, but at the same time, he felt it was a unique opportunity to reaffirm his commitment to his transformation. The event took place on a sunny morning in a simple auditorium, with chairs arranged in circles. When he entered, Marcos felt a bit nervous. He had never been good at public speaking, and the idea of exposing himself in front of people who might not fully understand his journey made him uncomfortable. But he knew that in order to move forward, he would have to open up and allow himself to be vulnerable. He sat in a chair at the back, waiting for the others to arrive. The place was quiet, with a welcoming atmosphere, but Marcos was still lost in his thoughts when, suddenly, he heard a familiar voice calling his name. Marcos? He turned quickly, his heart leaping when he saw who was standing before him. Anna, with a warm smile on her face, was approaching. She was there at the event, apparently attending a case or maybe as part of a program related to her work. Anna, what are you doing here? I work with the people from the reintegration program. You know, I was invited to join this event and be part of the discussion. I thought it would be interesting to see what's going on. Marcos wasn't sure what to say, but at the same time, he felt an immense relief seeing Anna. She was a stable point in his life, someone who knew his past but still believed in the possibility of change. Her presence there, in that moment, was a quiet reminder that he wasn't alone, that there were people willing to walk beside him, even when he felt like he was groping in the dark. I didn't know you were part of this too, Marcos said with a slight nervous laugh. But I'm glad you came. I'm not really sure how I'm going to do in this event, you know? Anna smiled with understanding. Don't worry, Marcos. The important thing is that you're here. And who knows, this might be a good moment for you to share a little of what you've learned. It doesn't have to be anything big or elaborate. Just be yourself. Marcos nodded, and their conversation continued, now more relaxed. They exchanged a few words about the event and what they were expecting from it. Anna, with her calm demeanor, managed to pass on a sense of peace to him. Marcos, though still nervous, already felt more prepared for what was to come. Soon, the chairs began to fill with other people from the program. Some seemed more at ease, others were visibly tense, like Marcos. However, they all had one thing in common: the desire to change their lives, the determination to leave the past behind and start fresh. The event began with a brief welcoming speech from one of the program coordinators who explained the dynamics and goals of the gathering. Today is about listening and being heard, said the coordinator. Here, everyone has the right to share their stories, without judgment. What matters is our willingness to move forward and make a difference for ourselves and for the people around us. Marcos felt a wave of emotion, but at the same time, a sense of belonging. It was as if this was a safe place where he could finally express himself without fear. He looked at Anna, who was sitting a little further ahead, arms crossed, attentive, but smiling encouragingly. When it was his turn to speak, Marcos's heart raced. He wasn't prepared for a grand presentation, but as he looked around at the faces around him, he saw that everyone was there for the same reasons. The people there weren't strangers. They were companions on the journey, all trying to rebuild their lives. I'm Marcos, he started, his voice trembling. I made mistakes that cost me a lot. But I'm here because some time ago, I decided I wanted to change. I'm not here to apologize or justify what I did, but to say that I'm trying to be a different person. I know it won't be easy, and maybe I'll fall again at some point. But I've learned that the important thing is to get back up, even after falling. And today, I feel like I'm closer to the person I want to be. This is my commitment to myself. He paused for a moment, feeling the weight of what he had just said. The other participants looked at him attentively, and he realized that by talking about his mistakes, his desire to change, he was allowing himself to be vulnerable, something he had never done before. But in that moment, he knew it was essential. There was a brief silence after his words, but soon a woman's soft, comforting voice interrupted him from the back of the room. I understand, Marcos. I'm trying to be someone different too. We're all here to learn and grow. And this is a great start. The room filled with murmurs of support. Her words resonated powerfully with Marcos. He wasn't alone. He felt that, somehow, all those people were there for the same reason: transformation. His journey was underway, and though it was a long path full of uncertainties, for the first time, he felt like he was finally heading in the right direction. After the event, when Marcos and Anna said their goodbyes, she hugged him sincerely, with a touch of warmth that made him feel stronger. She knew how important that moment was for him. "You were amazing, Marcos. I'm so proud of you. Remember, it doesn't matter how many times you fall. What matters is the courage to keep going. And you have that courage." With those words, she stepped away, and Marcos stood there alone for a moment, reflecting on everything that had happened. He still had a lot to face, many internal battles to win, but that day, he had taken a crucial step in his journey. He no longer saw himself as the man who had made mistakes, but as the man willing to rebuild himself, piece by piece, and find the peace he'd been searching for. Marcos's journey had only just begun, but for the first time, he felt that the future had something to offer him. The days following the event passed with a strange sense of lightness. Marcos felt something had shifted inside him, something deep and lasting. That event, the opportunity to speak in front of others, had been more than just a conversation. For him, it had been a turning point, a confirmation of what he'd always known deep down. He was on a difficult, but true path. Anna, as always, continued to be there in a quiet, yet essential way. Sometimes, a simple text, a message of support he'd received during the week, made all the difference. Their connection, which had begun unexpectedly in that courtroom, was now growing into something more solid. To Marcos, she wasn't just a friend. She had become a silent mentor, someone who gave him the push he often didn't even know he needed. In the following days, he dedicated himself more fervently to the reintegration program. The activities and meetings became more than just an obligation. They were a reflection of his internal transformation. He began to see the importance of every small step, the group meetings, the reflection exercises, even the job skills classes. Each moment seemed like an opportunity to learn, to grow. The work at the hardware store, which had once been just a way to support himself, now had new meaning. Marcos put more effort into his tasks than ever before. He realized that the effort he put into each task, even the simplest ones, reflected his inner change. His boss, who had once seen him with a bit of suspicion, began to notice the difference in Marcos's behavior. He was more attentive, more focused, and, above all, more willing to learn. The respect his colleagues showed him also grew. For the first time, Marcos felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. However, one night, something unexpected happened. Marcos was leaving work, walking to the bus station, when he spotted a familiar face in the distance. As he got closer, his surprise grew. It was his defense lawyer, the same one who had been with him through the hardest months of his trial. The man was standing there, seemingly waiting for someone, but when he saw Marcos, his face lit up with a smile that seemed genuine. "Marcos, long time no see, my friend," he said, extending his hand. Marcos stopped for a moment, unsure of how to react. It wasn't common to see him outside the courtroom, especially in such a casual setting. But seeing the lawyer's sincere smile, he shook his hand, feeling a strange sense of gratitude. "Hey, doctor. I didn't expect to see you here. Well, I'm here for personal reasons, but I see you're doing well. How's it been?" the lawyer asked with genuine interest. Marcos hesitated for a moment, but decided to be honest. "I'm trying. I really want to change, to move forward, but I know I still have a long way to go." The lawyer studied him closely, as if evaluating Marcos's words. "I've always known you had potential, Marcos. What you went through, the situation you faced, was tough for everyone, but I always believed you could turn things around. And it looks like you're doing it." Marcos felt a lump in his throat hearing those words. He'd always known the lawyer believed in him, but hearing it again, after all this time, was something unexpected. "I still have a lot to learn," he replied humbly. "But I know that change starts from within. I'm trying, really." The lawyer smiled, now more relaxed. "That's what matters, Marcos. You can't change the past, but the way you respond to it, that's what makes all the difference. And you're showing everyone that your response is headed in the right direction." The conversation lasted a few more minutes, but soon they said their goodbyes, each going their separate way. Marcos, however, felt a wave of optimism spread inside him. It was as if that meeting was yet another confirmation that he was on the right path, another piece of the puzzle he was putting together. He didn't need everyone's approval, but the recognition that he was genuinely trying to do something different, that carried immense weight. In the days that followed, Marcos began to get involved in small projects within the reintegration program, simple things like helping to organize events and talks on social reintegration. He began to feel that through these small contributions, he wasn't just helping others but also strengthening himself. He realized that true change wasn't just internal, but external as well. When he helped others feel better, he also felt more complete. However, the big test was yet to come. In a meeting with the social workers, it was announced that the program was offering a few spots for internships and formal reintegration in partner companies. For Marcos, this was an opportunity he couldn't pass up. But it was also a moment of great anxiety. The fear of being rejected because of his past still consumed him, and the thought of exposing himself to the corporate world again, where his criminal record could be a barrier, made him insecure. He knew prejudice was still a reality, but the desire for a fresh start was stronger. "I'll try," he said to himself, looking at the application form. That night, he grabbed his phone and sent a message to Anna. She always knew how to help him see things more clearly. "Anna, I'm scared to try for the internship. What if they don't accept me? What if my past holds me back?" Minutes later, her reply came. "Marcos, you have the right to try. Your past doesn't define who you are now. Don't let the fear of not being accepted paralyze you. What matters is what you're doing now, and you're doing the right thing. Go for it. I believe in you." Anna's words gave him the strength he needed. Marcos took a deep breath and filled out the form with determination. He knew that, no matter the result, he was on the right path. What mattered now was giving his best, trying to overcome his own fears, and continuing to rebuild himself, day by day. One step at a time, Marcos moved forward. The journey of change had no end, but now he knew that each step was valid. Every effort counted. The future was still uncertain, but he was ready to face it. Marcos was at a crossroads. The acceptance letter for the internship had arrived the day after he applied, and with it a new challenge. The excitement of being accepted quickly mixed with a wave of anxiety. He knew this internship was his golden opportunity. It was his chance to prove himself to the world, to show he was more than the mistakes of his past. But at the same time, a deep fear paralyzed him. The fear of being rejected, of being judged before he even had a chance, had always lurked beneath the surface of his choices. And now, that fear felt more real than ever. In the days that followed, Marcos was consumed by doubt. Every time he thought about going to the internship, he saw himself in front of a mirror reflecting his own insecurity. He knew that the world's judgment wasn't simple, and sometimes reality was more cruel than he imagined. The past, with its scars, could still be a huge barrier to overcome. The night before he was to start the internship, he decided to write to Anna, looking for some relief. "Anna, I'm so nervous. I know this is my chance, but what if they don't really accept me? What if I'm not good enough?" Her reply came quickly. "Marcos, you don't have to be perfect, you just have to be you. And being you is what got you here. They can't judge you for something you're already trying to change. Remember what you've learned so far. Change starts within you. You've already taken the first step. The rest will come with time." Her words were like a balm. He knew Anna always had this way of calming him, of helping him see things from a new perspective. With a deep sigh, he pushed aside the anxiety, at least for that night, and prepared himself for the next day. He didn't know what to expect, but he knew he was ready to try. The day came, and Marcos woke up earlier than usual. The nervousness was still there, but he swallowed it down, dressing in simple but clean and well-kept clothes. He looked at himself in the mirror one last time before heading out. The person he saw in the reflection was different from the one he had known in the past. He was no longer a man weighed down by guilt, but someone willing to build a new future. Arriving at the internship location, Marcos was greeted by a friendly supervisor named Ricardo. The environment was modern and impersonal, an office with glass walls and a constant flow of people moving between desks. The supervisor led him to a station, a quiet corner where he could begin learning the internship duties. He settled in, feeling the pressure of the first few minutes. "Marcos, I know this isn't an easy start, but we want to help you find your place. "Feel free to ask anything you need, and if you need something, I'll be around," said Ricardo, offering a warm smile. Marcos nodded, relieved by the supervisor's kindness. He knew that the work environment was key to his adjustment, and that friendly start eased some of his nerves. Still, the anxiety didn't fully disappear. He knew this would be a time of tests. What he didn't know was that the real test would come much sooner than expected. On the second day of his internship, he was assigned a simple but crucial task: organizing the documentation for some contracts. Marcos focused, trying to keep his mind on the task and shake off the feelings of insecurity. For hours, he sifted through papers, made notes, and began to get used to the routine. But what he didn't expect was that, when he stood up to head to the printer, he bumped into someone. "Hey, sorry," said the familiar voice. Marcos quickly looked up, and his heart raced. Standing before him was someone he never thought he'd see there, his former classmate, Julia. She was dressed in formal clothes, her expression serious, but when she saw Marcos, her eyes widened in surprise. "Marcos? You here?" Marcos was speechless for a few seconds. The last time he had seen Julia, they were still teenagers in high school. They weren't exactly close friends, but his memories of that time were of a simpler period, free from the shadows of the past that now followed him. "Julia? I didn't know you worked here." Julia smiled, but there was something in her eyes that seemed to reveal a mix of surprise and hesitation. She looked at Marcos's ID badge, then back at his face, as though trying to piece together a puzzle. I work in the finance department here. I didn't know you were part of this reintegration program. How's it going for you?" She asked with a softness that made Marcos uncomfortable, as if she were analyzing him in a way he wasn't ready for. Julia's question seemed innocent enough, but Marcos felt a pang of unease. He knew the past always came back, but he never imagined it would return with such force, with a face so familiar and a gaze so intense. "It's been tough," he answered, trying not to reveal too much. "But I'm trying. Every day is a fight to move forward." Julia seemed to understand, but there was a distance in her gaze that Marcos couldn't ignore. She seemed uncomfortable, like she was searching for the right words, but didn't know how to find them. At the same time, he felt like she was seeing him, perhaps unwittingly, in a different light, and that made him uncomfortable. I hope things get better for you, Marcos. And if you need anything, you know where to find me," she said before quickly walking away, as if she had something urgent to do. Marcos stood there, feeling the weight of the conversation. Meeting Julia was something he hadn't anticipated. She represented a part of his past he couldn't erase, and in that moment, he felt her judgment right there, silently lingering in the subtext of her words and the look she had given him. After that encounter, Marcos struggled to focus on his tasks. He felt like he was being watched, not just by Julia, but by everyone around him. The pressure to prove that he was there on his own merit, not out of pity, felt unbearable. But by the end of the day, he took a deep breath and tried to put aside his insecurities. He knew he couldn't control how others reacted, but he could control how he responded to them. As he left work, he thought about Anna's words, and they calmed him. What matters is what you do now. And he knew, more than ever, that he needed to stay strong and move forward. Time seemed to drag for Marcos. Each day at the internship was a quiet battle against his own fears and the prejudice he sometimes felt, sometimes more real, other times more imagined. The encounter with Julia, though brief, had stirred something inside him in an unexpected way. The distance she had shown, the look of doubt in her eyes, stayed in his mind, and he couldn't shake it off. He caught himself thinking about how his presence in the workplace might be under scrutiny by others too. In the following days, the sense of being watched grew stronger. Marcos noticed that many conversations in the office would quiet down when he walked by, or they would turn into vague and awkward discussions. He felt that people, without saying a word, were constantly evaluating him, maybe not for his competence, but for the stigma of his past. He tried not to listen, but every gesture, every glance seemed to confirm what he feared. One particularly tough day, Marcos was sitting at his desk when a conversation between two co-workers reached his ears. Unintentionally, he caught fragments of what they were saying. "Have you seen that new intern, Marcos? I heard he has a complicated past," one coworker commented in a low voice. The other replied with a tone of distrust. "Yeah, it's complicated. But the reintegration program gives these opportunities, right? I don't know, I have my doubts about it." Marcos felt a chill run down his spine. It wasn't the first time he'd heard something like that, but that morning, the words stuck in his mind with a force that left him unsettled. He felt the weight of the judgment on him, and for a moment, the idea that he might not be able to overcome it took over. He quickly stood up, trying to hide the pain, and walked to the break room for a coffee. There, alone, he allowed himself to feel the weight of their words. It was hard to ignore the feeling of being constantly judged. The situation was draining, but at the same time, he knew he couldn't let the stigma of his past steal the chance he had now. He had made a choice, to change, to start over, and not to turn back. People might have their doubts, but he couldn't doubt himself anymore. When he returned to his desk, his mind in turmoil, he realized he couldn't let these thoughts consume him. He focused on the tasks in front of him, diving into them as a way to escape the pressure. But he couldn't deny it. The prejudice was there, lurking in every curious glance and every whispered word. At the end of the workday, Ricardo, his supervisor, approached him. "Marcos, I need to talk to you for a minute," he said, his tone more serious than usual. Marcos's heart tightened. He quickly stood up and followed Ricardo to the meeting room. When the door closed behind them, he remained silent, waiting for what would come next. The supervisor seemed calm, but there was a tension in the air that Marcos couldn't decipher. "Marcos, I know you've been working hard. The work you've been doing has been good, and I can see you're trying, but there's something I need to tell you," Ricardo began, not looking directly into Marcos's eyes. Marcos swallowed hard, feeling a heavy lump in his throat. "Here it comes," he thought. "Here comes the truth, the confrontation with my past. What do they really think of me? I've heard some things in the office. Some people are uncomfortable with your presence here," Ricardo continued, finally looking at him. "It's not easy, I know. They're talking about your history, about what you've been through. And I want you to know that. It's something we need to deal with." Marcos felt a warm flush creep up his face. He wanted to respond, but the words wouldn't come. He knew what it meant. The judgment, the prejudice he felt in the air, was real. He wasn't just being paranoid. It was true. People saw him through the lens of his past, not his current efforts. Ricardo, seeing Marcos's silence, continued. "But I want you to know that, despite this, you're here for a reason. I believe you can overcome this, and I'm going to help you. What matters is your work, your commitment to what you're doing. We're not going to let other people's opinions make you give up. That wouldn't be fair to you." Those words were like a breath of fresh air for Marcos. He didn't know what he had expected to hear, but in that moment, he felt he wasn't alone. Ricardo wasn't judging him. On the contrary, he was offering him a real opportunity for change. His support, though brief, was just what Marcos needed to stay strong. But he knew this didn't mean it would be easy. The prejudice, both from his coworkers and from himself, was still there, and he would have to fight it every day. That night, as Marcos walked home, he reflected on everything he had heard. He couldn't control other people's opinions, but he could control how he would react to them. He no longer wanted to live in fear of what others thought. He wanted to prove, especially to himself, that he was capable of rewriting his own story. When he got home, he decided to call Anna. She always knew how to calm him down, how to help him see beyond the storm. "Anna, you won't believe what happened today," Marcos started, his voice tense. He told her everything about his conversation with Ricardo, and as he listened to his friend's supportive words, he felt lighter. Anna, once again, was the voice of reason he needed. "Marcos, you're not in that life anymore. What people think of you can't define who you are now. I know it's hard, but don't let other people's insecurities affect you. You're doing what's right, and that's what matters. Keep giving your best. They'll see it." The conversation with Anna gave him the boost he needed. For the first time in a long time, Marcos felt stronger than the prejudice that surrounded him. He knew the journey wouldn't be easy, but he also knew he wasn't alone anymore. With a renewed commitment to himself, Marcos prepared for the days ahead. He wouldn't be a victim of other people's opinions anymore. He would prove himself, not to others, but to himself. The rest, he knew, would come with time. The pace of the internship was just as intense, but something inside Marcos had changed. Each day felt like a small step toward his true self, the one he was starting to understand more clearly with every new task completed, with every new look he met with more confidence. Still, the weight of other people's judgment was there, and it wasn't something he could just ignore. But something in Marcos had solidified. He was determined to prove himself. Not just to others, but to himself. That morning, in particular, brought a strange sense of anticipation. Marcos had an important meeting with a team that handled contracts, and he knew it was a crucial opportunity to show even more of himself, to make it clear that he was there because of merit, not compassion. He had reviewed the documents the night before, prepared as best he could, but as the time for the meeting drew closer, anxiety took over him. I need to do this. I need to show them that I'm ready. I can't doubt myself anymore. These thoughts ran through his mind as he got ready and headed to work. When he arrived at the office, Ricardo called him into the meeting. He was accompanied by a team of lawyers and other interns. The table was large, and the environment felt formal. Marcos walked to his seat, trying to steady his breath, his nerves more on edge than ever. He looked around and once again felt that sideways glance, the hidden judgment that was still there. He knew the workplace could be ruthless, especially for someone like him, someone still carrying the marks of a difficult past. During the meeting, Marcos focused on what he had to do. The lawyer's words, the documents, the reports all passed before him like a rushing stream, but he stayed firm. He knew he would need to speak up if necessary and couldn't let the nervousness take over. When it was his turn to present the analyses he had done on the contracts, his heart raced. He stood up, and what seemed like a simple task for any other intern became a personal test. He looked at the faces watching him. The tone of judgment, which he tried to ignore, was there. But he focused on the words he had written, on the careful analyses he had done. He had something important to say, and it would be heard. I reviewed the contracts and found some clauses that, if not adjusted, could cause future issues, he said, more firmly than he expected. Silence filled the room. He felt all eyes turn toward him, a look that seemed heavier than before. But he didn't stop. He continued his explanation clearly and objectively, and slowly, the lawyer started engaging with him, asking questions, requesting more details. And little by little, he realized that he was getting the attention he had longed for. He was being heard, truly heard. When the meeting ended, Ricardo approached him with a light smile on his face. Marcos, you did a great job. I knew you had what it takes. Keep it up, okay? That was impressive. But before he could thank him, the door suddenly opened, and Julia walked in. She seemed rushed, almost unwilling to look directly at Marcos, but she made an effort to greet him. Marcos, you were excellent in the meeting. I didn't know you were so sharp with the details, she said with a tone that seemed genuine. Marcos felt a chill. He didn't know how to respond, but the words that were about to come out of his mouth were interrupted by a question from one of the lawyers on the team. Who is he? The new intern? Asked the lawyer, looking at Marcos with an inquisitive gaze. Julia hesitated for a second, but then responded with an impressive naturalness. Yes, he's with us. Marcos was a surprise. He's doing really well. Marcos stared at her. Her discomfort, the way she avoided eye contact, it all seemed more obvious now. She was trying to be polite, but he knew there was still a distance between them. The weight of the doubt he felt, the judgment she still carried about him, it was all at play in that simple moment. He didn't know how to react. The gratitude for her words mixed with the feeling that he couldn't escape the perception she had of him. However, at the end of the day, when Marcos was about to leave, he stopped in front of the hallway mirror. He looked at his reflection, as he always did, but now there was something new in his eyes. He wasn't as disturbed by what Julia thought or by what others thought of him anymore. He knew he was there on his own merit. He was good at what he did. And that, in contrast to everything he had been through, was enough. Anna called him shortly after work, and he didn't hesitate to tell her about the meeting. She, as always, made sure to remind him of his importance, of his progress. He felt, in a way, stronger, more certain of his journey. Marcos, do you realize? You're doing it. It doesn't matter what others think. It doesn't matter if there are doubtful looks. What matters is your work. What you're doing now, you're doing it for yourself. And that's all that matters. With Anna's calm voice echoing in his mind, Marcos lay down that night, more at peace than he had been in weeks. He knew the road would still be long and full of obstacles, but for the first time, he felt like he was in control. He wasn't running from himself anymore, nor from his past. He was facing the future head-on, and that was all he needed to move forward. The sun rose lazily that Monday morning, but for Marcos, time seemed to move slower. He couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to happen. Something he knew was coming, but he didn't know how he would face it. He had done his best, shown his competence in the internship, but now, with the end of the reintegration program in sight, things seemed to be getting more complicated. His past, which he thought he had buried, was approaching, ready to revisit his life relentlessly. The final judgment wasn't about his competence, but about the perception people had of him and that weight he felt on his shoulders. It was an ordinary day, like any other, but the atmosphere was charged with tension. As he walked into the office, Marcos noticed the environment was heavier than usual. Conversations died down as he passed, and some looks seemed more intense than normal. He knew the end of the internship was near, and with it would come new evaluations, both of his performance and his history. Decisions were being made, and he felt each one like a silent blow. Ricardo, his supervisor, called him into his office right after work. Marcos's heart raced. He sat at the desk, trying not to show his nerves, but couldn't hide the weight of the situation. "Marcos, I need to talk to you about your future here at the company," Ricardo said, his gaze serious. Ricardo's tone wasn't the same as before. There was no longer that unshakable confidence he had shown in previous weeks. Marcos felt the knot in his throat tighten even more. "First of all, I want you to know that you've been doing very well with the tasks. I recognize that. But there are things we can't ignore." Those words hit him like a weight, each one echoing in his mind. He knew what was coming wouldn't be easy. "I know your background is complicated. Everyone knows," Ricardo continued, with a softer but still serious look. "The whole situation with your criminal past has been a challenge for you, hasn't it? And honestly, it's not easy for anyone to deal with." Marcos remained silent. Those words, the ones he had feared most, were finally being said aloud. He wanted to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He swallowed hard, struggling with the pain of hearing them for the first time from someone he trusted. "I know you've shown effort and dedication, but the truth is people fear what they don't understand," Ricardo went on. "And in a corporate environment, that becomes a problem. Perceptions are hard to change, and unfortunately, there's external pressure we can't ignore." Marcos felt his palms sweat. He knew where this was going. The company had shown signs of this before. The pressure to keep him around, as a functional yet invisible piece, was becoming unbearable. He wasn't just an intern anymore, but someone marked by a past that could no longer be hidden. "What are you telling me?" Marcos finally managed to ask, his voice faltering a bit. Ricardo sighed, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm saying you can't stay here anymore. Not because you're incompetent, Marcos. But the pressure's going to get worse, and we can't risk the company's reputation over something that's beyond your control and ours. People just don't have the tolerance for it. And I fear if you stay, you'll become a target. You have so much potential, but this place isn't where you'll thrive. I've tried my best, but the atmosphere has been heavy." The blow hit harder than Marcos expected. He wasn't surprised, but still, the pain hit him with full force. He didn't know how to react. He didn't know what to do with the whirlwind of emotions that now consumed him. He felt defeated, but at the same time, something inside him told him this wasn't the end. He still had control over his life, and this couldn't be the final word. "So, what happens to me now?" he asked, trying to find some clarity amidst the emotional chaos. Ricardo looked at him, his face serious, but with a look of empathy in his eyes. "You have a lot of potential, Marcos. I'm going to talk to a few people. There may be other opportunities, maybe elsewhere. But here, I can't keep you. I wish I could change things, but the circumstances are bigger than both of us." Marcos felt the lump in his throat. He stood up, thanked Ricardo, but couldn't shake the weight of the words echoing in his mind. "What's going to happen to me now?" he thought. He knew this moment, this closing of a chapter, wasn't final, but still, it felt like a deep blow to his dream of change. As he left the office, his co-workers didn't say a word. He felt them like shadows, sneaky glances, those same looks he'd been sensing from the start. Now, everything seemed clearer, and the pain was almost unbearable. He still had a long road ahead, but the weight of judgment felt stronger than ever. When he got home, Marcos allowed himself to sit on the edge of the bed. What could he do now? He wanted to fight, to prove he could overcome any obstacle, but the reality of his situation felt as imposing as the walls of an invisible prison. Then the phone rang. It was Anna. "Marcos, you won't believe this. I'm hearing something. There's a meeting tomorrow, an opportunity. It could change everything. Don't give up now. I know you can do it." He took a deep breath. For a moment, he didn't know whether to believe her or not. But even in his pain, he knew Anna was always right. She was right. He couldn't give up. The battle was far from over, and maybe tomorrow would be the day everything changed for him. He hung up the phone, closed his eyes, and for the first time that night, allowed himself to believe in the future. Even though the weight of the past still lingered, he knew the fight wasn't over. He still had one more chance. Marcos woke up that morning feeling a weight on his shoulders. But unlike the other days, something inside him pushed him forward. It wasn't the first time he'd found himself at a crossroads, but something inside him, like a spark of hope, seemed to shine brighter. Anna's calls still echoed in his mind. He didn't know exactly what to expect from the meeting tomorrow, but he knew he needed to be ready. The opportunity she mentioned could be his last chance to change the course of his life. He looked at himself in the mirror, his eyes still carrying the tension from the days before. But there was something different in the reflection staring back at him. He was determined. Nothing would stop him now. The day passed slowly, and Marcos focused on preparing. He reviewed all the necessary documents, read reports, and even took notes on potential questions that might come up during the meeting. He was determined not to let any opportunity slip by. When the day finally came, he dressed more carefully than usual. Something inside him told him this meeting could be a turning point. He took a deep breath, looked at his reflection one more time, and headed to work with the feeling that something big was about to happen. When he arrived at the office, the atmosphere was different. Lighter, maybe because of the new day or perhaps the anticipation of what was to come. Ricardo was in the hallway, with a look that said he knew something that hadn't been said yet. When he saw Marcos, he gave a slight gesture with his hand, signaling him to follow. "We need to talk," Ricardo said, his tone softer than before. Marcos followed him to the meeting room. He knew the words to come would be decisive, but he also didn't want to let anxiety take over. The meeting was about to start. "Marcos, I've spoken to a few people. The situation isn't simple, but they agreed to listen to you. It's a rare chance, but I know you have what it takes to seize it. Trust in what you can do," Ricardo said, sitting at the table with the same serious expression. Ricardo's words gave him some comfort, but also a heavy sense of pressure. He sat in the chair across from the table, feeling the weight of everyone's expectations on him. With every step he took, it felt like the future was being built. He looked around the room, and for a moment, he felt small. The glass walls reflected the sunlight in a cold, distant way, and there he was, vulnerable, about to face the judgment that could change everything. He knew this wasn't just about his skills. It was about who he was, about how they saw him. Finally, the meeting began. A long table with several executives sitting around it. Each one looked at him with an attentive but skeptical gaze. Marcos realized that the perceptions of his past were still there, lingering like shadows in the room. But he couldn't let that shake him. He had a mission, to show them who he really was. He had prepared for this moment. Now it was time to put everything he knew into practice. The meeting was intense. Questions came up, some tough, others easier. Each answer Marcos gave was clear and confident. He felt the tension in the air, but refused to let fear take over. He was there to prove his worth, to show that he wasn't defined by a mistake from a distant past. During the discussion, one of the executives, a woman with a rigid posture, raised her voice. "Marcos, do you really believe you can be part of this team? With what we know about your past, how can you expect anyone to trust you? How can we be sure you'll be a reliable choice for what the company needs?" Her words cut through the air like a knife. Silence fell over the room, and all eyes turned to him. Marcos felt his blood rush to his head, but he couldn't let anger take over. He knew this question came from a deep place, from a doubt that no one had dared to express so directly. He took a deep breath, and when his voice came out, it was calm, but full of a determination he didn't know he had. "I know my past can't be erased. I can't change what happened. But what I can guarantee is that I'm someone committed to the present and the future. I'm not here to beg or to be an experiment. I'm here because I can make a difference. I can show you that, with time, I can be someone you can trust. If you give me this chance, I promise I won't disappoint you. Not for me, but for everything I've gone through to get here." Marcos's words reverberated in the room. He was being honest, transparent. He wasn't just asking for a chance, he was demanding the right to be seen, to be judged for who he was now, not for what he had done in the past. The executive looked at him, seemingly surprised by his answer, but she didn't seem willing to give in. She leaned back in her chair, thoughtful. Ricardo then intervened, his voice firmer. "I've been following Marcos's work closely, and I can tell you he's shown more than just technical skills. He's overcome obstacles that most people wouldn't understand. I believe in him, and I believe he deserves a chance. This isn't about erasing the past, it's about giving him the right to prove that he can earn a new future." Silence stretched for a few seconds, but for Marcos, that moment felt like an eternity. He knew the decision was being made right then, at that moment. Finally, the company president, a calm and thoughtful man, looked at Marcos and gestured with his hand. "Let's give him a chance. But, Marcos, know that you'll have to prove every day that you deserve this chance. There's no room for mistakes anymore." Marcos felt a huge weight lift off his shoulders. He looked at Ricardo, who gave him a subtle smile, as if saying, "I knew you could do it." What would happen now was just a matter of time, but suddenly, he felt that everything he had lived through until now hadn't been in vain. He was stronger. He had more than a second chance. He had the power to rewrite his own story. As he left the meeting room, Anna's words came back to him. "I know you'll make it." And for the first time, Marcos believed that, yes, he had made it. The first few days after the meeting were a whirlwind for Marcos. What had once seemed like an uncertain and unstable terrain was now starting to reveal itself as a real opportunity. He was determined not to let it slip by. Every project he got involved in, every task assigned to him, he gave his best. He knew he couldn't afford to make mistakes. The slightest failure could be seen as confirmation that he didn't belong there. However, the atmosphere in the office was still heavy. While some of his colleagues had shown some support, others didn't hide their mistrust. Marcos felt as though he was being constantly watched. Not by everyone, but by some who still saw him as the man from a distant past, the one who had failed and paid the price for it. The pressure was immense, but he was determined to show that he was there on merit. It was on one of these days, while dealing with an important report, that he first saw the true measure of his worth in the corporate world. During a meeting with one of the directors, he presented a solution no one else had suggested. Something simple, but effective. He had learned from experience that, often, complex solutions weren't the answer. Simplicity was underestimated. He demonstrated this with a practical example, and the director, impressed by the effectiveness of his proposal, publicly praised him. "Marcos, that was an excellent suggestion," the director said, with a brief but sincere smile. Marcos felt a deep sense of relief. The validation of his idea was confirmation that he was on the right path, but he knew there was still a long way to go before he'd be recognized as someone who truly deserved to be there, someone who had exceeded expectations. He knew this was just the beginning. What Marcos didn't expect, however, was that his next test would come much sooner than he had imagined. It was a mistake in a financial report that led to him being called into the president's office. It was a small calculation error, but given the weight of the document, that small mistake turned into a big problem. As he was called into the president's office, Marcos felt the weight of the situation. He knew that a mistake like that could be the end of his second chance. When he entered the room, the president was reclining behind an imposing desk, staring intently at the papers in front of him. He didn't need to say a word for Marcos to know what he was referring to. "Marcos, you know this can't happen, right? This mistake is unacceptable, especially with the responsibility you have now." His voice wasn't aggressive, but the coldness was palpable. Marcos swallowed hard, trying to keep calm. He knew an explanation wouldn't solve the problem, but it was important to be transparent. "I know. It was my mistake, sir. I should have double-checked. And I'll make sure this doesn't happen again. It was a slip-up, a failure on my part. I'm willing to fix it and take all the necessary steps to make sure it doesn't happen again." The president looked at him for a few seconds, as if weighing his words. Finally, he sighed and leaned back in his chair. "I'm not going to fire you for one mistake. Everyone makes mistakes, Marcos. But if you want to stay here, you have to show you're willing to learn from them and that you'll do whatever it takes to prevent them from happening again. What matters now is that you show commitment." The president's words were a relief, but Marcos knew he couldn't let this mistake become a burden. He would leave that room with one clear lesson. He had to be more careful, more vigilant. It wasn't enough to be good. He had to be excellent. In the days that followed, he dedicated himself even more to his work. He questioned every decision he made, reviewed all reports, and before submitting any work, he always made sure there were no errors. His colleagues began to notice the change. He was putting in effort they had never seen before. Although there was still some distrust, a few began to look at him with more respect. But as Marcos overcame one challenge after another, he knew the greatest test was still ahead. The hardest part, without a doubt, would be Anna's reaction. She, who had always supported him, always believed in him, would now see if he could truly hold his position and move forward. She knew Marcos was capable of great things, but she also knew the shadows of his past could be hard to shake. And he feared that, at some point, she might grow tired of his struggle. But he also knew that if anyone deserved to know about his journey, it was her. When he finally had a moment to breathe, Marcos grabbed his phone and called Anna. "Hey, Marcos. How's it going? Did you get everything done?" she asked, her voice as upbeat as always. Marcos hesitated for a moment before answering. "It's going. Still a long way to go, but I'm managing. I had a little setback, a mistake in a report, but I've fixed everything, and I'm being more careful. I can't let stupid mistakes happen. I can't let this chance slip away." Anna was silent for a moment, as if weighing the seriousness of his words. Then, in a soft voice, she said, "I know you're fighting, Marcos, and I know you won't give up. What you need to understand is that mistakes will happen, and what matters is how you react to them. Don't be too hard on yourself, okay? You're doing well. I see the change in you, and I trust you." Anna's words were a balm to Marcos's heart. She was still there, still believing in him, and he knew that meant more than any recognition. He was ready to keep fighting, not just for her or for himself, but for something bigger, his own redemption. As the night fell, Marcos looked out the window at the horizon. The future seemed less uncertain. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew he was on the right path. He was rebuilding his life, one choice at a time. The relief Marcos felt when he left the meeting room was almost tangible. The weight of judgment that had tormented him so much was beginning to lift. He knew the road ahead would still be tough, but at that moment, he felt a sense of victory he hadn't experienced in years. He had the chance to rewrite his story, to prove that his past didn't define who he was. The company's decision wasn't just a job opportunity, but the doorway to a new beginning. Marcos sat at his desk, taking a deep breath as he watched his colleagues move around him. The atmosphere was calmer, but at the same time, he knew that everyone's approval wouldn't be immediate. The board's decision had been clear. He would have to work twice as hard to earn the trust of those who still doubted him. And he was willing to do that. He had faced much bigger storms. It wouldn't be this moment that would make him give up. At the end of the day, Marcos grabbed his phone, hesitated for a moment, and then dialed Anna's number. He couldn't wait any longer. He needed to talk to her, thank her, share his success. When she picked up, her excited voice was like balm to his soul. "Marcos, I knew you could do it. Tell me everything. What happened? How was the meeting?" Marcos smiled, feeling the warmth of Anna's friendship and genuine support. "I made it, Anna. They decided to give me a chance. The executive who doubted me most didn't want to, but the president, he believed. He said I'd have to prove I deserved to be there, but in the end, it worked out. I knew you were ready for this. You have everything it takes, Marcos. You just needed to believe in yourself more." Marcos felt a knot release in his chest. Anna had always known how to comfort him in difficult times. She, more than anyone, understood the weight of his past, but she also knew his strength. They had been friends since high school, and their friendship had never wavered, even when he took the wrong path. Anna always believed in him, and now, more than ever, she saw him growing. "I don't know how to thank you, Anna. You made me see that I could still fight, that I wasn't finished. I felt so lost before, but now, I can feel the wind changing. You don't need to thank me. You earned it, Marcos. And you're going to achieve so much more." The conversation continued for a few more minutes, but Marcos couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened up to that point. He knew that the weight of the approval he had received wasn't the end of the battle. It was just the beginning of a new cycle. He would have to work hard to show that the opportunity he had been given wasn't a mistake. But for the first time in a long time, he felt ready for that challenge. That night, as he prepared for bed, Marcos's mind was at peace. He thought about all that could come, the challenges and difficulties, but also the inner strength he had discovered in himself. He had learned that, although his past was a part of who he was, he didn't need to be defined by it anymore. The future was in his hands now, and he was determined to make the most of the opportunity he had just been given. The next day was filled with new expectations. Marcos arrived at work with a sense of renewal. He knew his colleagues were still watching his every move, but he didn't care. What really mattered was his performance, how he would turn every task, every challenge, into a reflection of the effort and determination he felt. He was there not to apologize for what he had done, but to show who he was now. Ricardo showed up at his desk later, with a friendlier expression than usual. "How are you feeling, Marcos? I know the road ahead won't be easy, but it's good to see that you're already adjusting to the change." Marcos smiled, but his response was filled with determination. "I know I still have a lot to prove. It won't be easy, but I'm ready. I want to show that I can be someone you can trust, and that keeping me here wasn't a mistake." Ricardo looked at him for a moment, apparently satisfied with the response. "I believe in you, and I know you'll do whatever it takes to grow. Just remember one thing. Whenever you need support, we're here to help. But the change has to come from you." Those words stayed with Marcos for the rest of the day. He knew the real work had only just begun. But unlike in the past, he wasn't alone anymore. He had friends like Anna, he had Ricardo's support, and most importantly, he now had trust to earn every day. When the workday ended, Marcos left the building with the feeling that something had permanently changed inside him. He still had much to learn, many obstacles to overcome. But now he had a real chance, something he hadn't had before. The right to write his own story. Looking at the horizon, Marcos smiled. He knew the next chapters of his life were still unwritten, and he was determined to write a different story. A story of overcoming, hard work, and most importantly, a story that showed that a person's true worth isn't defined by their mistakes, but by the choices they make from now on. Marcos had never imagined that the weight of responsibility could feel so real and so physical. In the early days of his restart at the company, he felt a renewed energy, almost like he was carrying a flag of hope. But now, as time passed, the demands increased, the pressures mounted, and the fear of failure never seemed to disappear. What seemed like a golden opportunity, a chance to rewrite his story, was becoming a test of endurance. He knew a single failure could be fatal. That morning, the atmosphere in the office was more tense than usual. Marcos had known in advance that in a few days, he'd have to present for a major project involving all the company's departments. He was prepared. But as he sat in front of the computer, the numbers seemed more challenging, the equations more complex. He knew what was at stake. His image, his career, everything he'd achieved so far was hanging on those reports. He could feel the sweat trickling down his temples as he reviewed the documents once more, keeping an eye on every detail. The phone rang. It was a message from Anna. Believe in yourself. No matter the pressure. You have everything you need to succeed. I trust you. Her words brought a momentary relief, but also a weight. Anna's trust, which had always been his greatest support, now felt like a huge expectation. He didn't want to disappoint her, nor let himself down again. And despite the weight of the pressure, Marcos knew the only way to prove himself was to keep going. In the meeting, nervousness overtook him. As he entered the room, the stares from his colleagues felt heavy. Some had their arms crossed, others just watched him, almost as if they were waiting for the next mistake. Marcos didn't let it faze him. He started presenting his report, highlighting the solutions he'd found for the company's financial challenges. He knew what he was doing. He knew that what was on the table was his work, the result of his nights of dedication. However, when he reached the most critical part of the presentation, the room fell silent. The CFO, a man known for being difficult and demanding, raised an eyebrow and asked, "Marcos, this profit projection for the next quarter, do you really think it's feasible? I'm not seeing a sufficient safety margin. This number might be a bit too optimistic, don't you think?" Marcos's heart raced. He looked at the screen, saw the number highlighted, and for a second, panic set in. He knew the doubt was legitimate. The projection was risky, but he believed in it. He paused, feeling the pressure of all eyes on him, and then replied, "I understand your concern, sir. But I believe that with the changes I suggested in cash flow and operational cost reductions, this is not just feasible, it's necessary to hit the quarterly goal. It's a calculated risk, but one that, in my view, can be managed." The room remained silent, and the CFO watched him intently, as if searching for a flaw in his words. But then, to everyone's surprise, he nodded slowly. "I'll need more proof of this, Marcos. But I trust your analysis. Just give me a more detailed review and bring it to the next meeting. Otherwise, we'll have to reassess the entire strategy." Marcos felt the weight of his words relieved, but not completely gone. He knew the next step would be even harder. He had to solidify his proposal, present more proof, ensure the risk didn't turn into failure. The responsibility he carried was not limited to his performance. It was directly tied to the company's success. At the end of the meeting, the other team members left the room, and Marcos stayed for a few more minutes, reviewing the points of his presentation. His mind was still racing, but he knew that if he wanted to continue on this path, he would have to be flawless in every move. There was no room for mistakes. When he returned to his desk, he found a message from Anna on his phone. "I'm so proud of you. I know the meeting was tough, but you did what you could. Now it's time to breathe and move on. Don't be too hard on yourself." Her words were comforting, but at the same time, a reminder of something he couldn't forget. He was trying to rewrite his story, and the pressure was a constant. With the decision to keep fighting, he replied, "I still have a long way to go, Anna. I can't fail now." As the day went on, Marcos felt a growing exhaustion. Every step now felt heavier than the last, and he began to feel the weight of being the last one to arrive, the outcast, the man from a dirty past. He knew there was still so much to do, many battles to win, but at that moment, doubts began to creep in. The fear of not being able to handle the pressure, of not being enough, infiltrated his mind. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to block out the whirlwind of thoughts, but it didn't work. That night, the phone rang. He looked at the number on the screen. It was Ricardo, the colleague who had become a sort of ally at work. Marcos answered quickly. "Hey, Marcos. How are you doing? I saw what happened in the meeting today. It wasn't easy, but you did well. I mean, you have what it takes to get through this. But I know it's not easy for you. Marcos took a deep breath before responding. He didn't want to show it, but the weight of the conversation was overwhelming him. It's not easy. It's not just the work. It's like every step here is like walking on a tightrope. I don't know if I can take the next step without falling. Ricardo was silent for a moment, then responded, his tone softer. I get it, Marcos. But what I can promise you is that you're not alone in this. Here, we help each other. I know the beginning was tough, and you have your reasons to worry, but you've come further than you realize. So, if you need anything, I'm here. Just let me know. Ricardo's words brought a relief that Marcos didn't know he needed. He wasn't alone anymore, even though sometimes it felt like he was. The road ahead was still tough, but he had allies. That, in some way, gave him the strength to keep going. And when the day finally came to an end, Marcos felt like the only thing he could do was keep moving forward. If he fell, he'd get up. If he made a mistake, he'd fix it. But the important thing was to keep going because there was no turning back. Marcos woke up early that morning. The day was gray. The sky seemed to reflect the internal turmoil he was going through. He had slept just a few hours, his mind restless over everything that had happened in the past few days. The pressure felt more intense, almost suffocating, and he didn't know how to deal with it. The confidence he had built seemed to crumble a little more each day. When he looked in the mirror, he felt stuck. He no longer knew if he was fighting for a clear goal or just trying to escape the fear of failure. As he got dressed and prepared for work, he tried to silence those doubts, but they wouldn't go away. Every step out of the house felt like a deeper step into the unknown. He knew that meeting would be a turning point. It was his chance to show everyone, including himself, that he wasn't just a man marked by his past, but someone capable of taking control of his own life. At the office, he found the atmosphere more tense than usual. Everyone was preparing for the day's meeting. The board was involved in an important project that required Marcos to analyze the latest financial projections. He was ready, but as he entered the conference room, he felt a chill down his spine. The air was thick, and his colleagues' stares felt penetrating. Some seemed to hope he would fail. Others were more skeptical than ever. The meeting started calmly, with each team member making their presentations. When it was Marcos's turn, he stood slowly, feeling all eyes on him. With his hands slightly trembling, he adjusted the papers on the table and began his presentation. The words came out more slowly than expected, and he noticed his confidence starting to waver. His voice, usually firm, was now filled with insecurity, and he knew it was noticeable. When presenting the financial projection, a new critique came from the CFO, sharp like a blade cutting through the silence. Marcos, I don't see how you can justify these numbers. They don't make sense with what we discussed earlier. Do you have any explanation for this? The CFO said, his gaze stern, clearly skeptical. The question was direct, but even harder to answer than he'd imagined. Marcos swallowed hard, trying to find a way to justify his decision. He knew the solution was valid, but the pressure made him falter. I understand your concerns, sir, but the calculations were based on the latest market trends. We're in a period of transition, and this projection takes into account a calculated risk. I can present more data, but I believe that with the adjustments I've proposed, we should see a good return. The CFO didn't seem convinced. He crossed his arms and wore a slight look of disdain. I get the theory, Marcos, but the reality is different. When you talk about adjustments, you're referring to decisions that might be too risky. I need to see more data. More evidence that this analysis isn't just being pushed forward to fit your own vision. The room fell into silence. Marcos felt the weight of those words like a stone crushing his chest. His mind started to spiral with doubts, as if each unspoken word added another mistake to the list of failures he felt he had accumulated. He tried to maintain his composure, but the anxiety caused his reasoning to falter. He knew he was losing control of the situation. I'll present the complete data soon, he said, trying to regain some confidence. His voice was weaker than he'd hoped. The meeting ended in a quiet tension, and Marcos retreated to his desk, exhausted. The CFO's words echoed in his mind like a hammer hitting his head. He wasn't just dealing with numbers. He was grappling with his own self-image, with the fear that he wasn't enough to meet the expectations placed on him. The doubt that once felt like a distant shadow now seemed like a constant presence. Hours passed as Marcos tried to fix the flaws in his report, tirelessly searching for the missing data that would convince the CFO that his projection was sound. But as evening approached, he felt emptier. The pressure was both physical and emotional. He wasn't just fighting a calculation error anymore. He was fighting the image he had of himself. Later that night, as he was getting ready to leave, he received a message from Anna. It was a short but comforting note. "I know it's not easy, Marcos, but I want you to remember one thing. You are more than any mistake. I trust you. I'll always trust you." He looked at the screen of his phone, feeling the bitterness of doubt ease just a little. If there was anyone who believed in him, it was Anna. And maybe that was exactly what he needed, to believe in himself the way she believed in him. He didn't know if the next day's meeting would be the chance he needed, but one thing he knew for sure: he couldn't let doubt control him anymore. He couldn't hide behind fear. He would give his best, not afraid to make mistakes, not afraid to fail. Because the greatest failure, he knew, would be not trying. The next morning, Marcos woke up feeling different. It was no longer fear that woke him up, but a quiet decision he had made the night before. He would face the pressure. He would face his own fears. Doubt was still there, but he had decided not to let it consume him. What scared him most was not failure, but the idea of not trying. The fear of hiding behind excuses. He knew the only way to rewrite his story was to keep trying, even when it seemed easier to give up. He grabbed a quick coffee, and before leaving the house, he glanced one more time at Anna's message. Her words still had the power to warm his heart, like an anchor, keeping him grounded in the storm. He took a deep breath, grabbed his coat, and left. When he arrived at the office, the atmosphere was quiet. Some colleagues were already at their desks, preparing for the meeting with the directors that would take place later that morning. Marcos felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, but unlike before, he didn't feel intimidated. He knew he had worked hard to get here, and the only way forward was to keep moving. As he quickly reviewed his numbers, he was interrupted by Ricardo's voice, who approached his desk. "How are you doing, Marcos?" Ricardo asked, offering an encouraging smile. He knew how tough the past weeks had been for Marcos and felt his friend needed a little push. "I'm better," Marcos smiled back, but his smile seemed distant, as if he was still preparing for something bigger. "Today's the day. I'll present the full data. I'll convince the CFO." Ricardo leaned in slightly, as if he knew what Marcos was feeling. "I know you can do it, Marcos. Just remember, it's not about proving something to others, but to yourself. You've got what it takes." Marcos thanked him, but Ricardo's words, though motivating, didn't fully lift the weight of responsibility. He knew he was at a turning point, and the future he envisioned depended on that meeting. The moment came faster than he expected. The atmosphere in the conference room was tense, but this time Marcos felt calmer. He didn't feel the panic he had before. As he entered the room, he felt the director's eyes on him, but instead of shrinking, he faced them head-on. He had something important to say, something bigger than the insecurities that had consumed him. He started the presentation, and this time, his words were steady. He knew what he was doing, and he knew the numbers he was presenting were solid, even with the risks involved. Each slide he moved through seemed like one more step toward his redemption. When he reached the most critical point, the CFO raised his hand again, interrupting him. The silence in the room became palpable. "Marcos, can I ask you a question?" the CFO said, with a tone Marcos couldn't quite decipher. He waited for the question, anxious, feeling his adrenaline spike. "Of course," Marcos answered, trying to remain calm. "These numbers, they're a lot bolder than what we proposed. What makes me believe you're being realistic and not just creating a perfect scenario to justify your projections?" Marcos felt the weight of the question. He could dodge it, try a more diplomatic answer, but something inside him told him to be honest, to show the true confidence he had in what he was proposing. "I believe that, yes, there are risks. No financial projection is without them. But the data points to a real growth opportunity. The market is changing, and the trends we're seeing reflect a bigger movement. We're not just reacting to the current situation, We're anticipating the future. I know it may seem bold, but this is how big companies grow. I've done the calculations, all possible adjustments, and the numbers don't lie. Marcos felt a weight in those words, a truth that was hard to face but necessary. The CFO watched him in silence, offering no immediate sign of approval or disapproval. The rest of the room was equally quiet. Marcos simply waited, his heart pounding, not knowing what would come next. After a pause that seemed endless, the CFO finally broke the silence. "Do you really believe what you're saying, Marcos?" he asked, with a softer look, as if he was seeing something different in the man before him. "I do," Marcos said, and this time, the confidence he felt was stronger than the fear. The CFO took a deep breath, finally nodding. "Then show me the data that justifies this. I want to see the detailed analysis of these projections. If you're really right, I'll support you." Marcos could hardly believe what he was hearing. He knew he would still have to work hard to convince everyone, but for the first time in a long while, he felt in control. He had surrendered to his truth, and that truth had been enough. At the end of the meeting, as he gathered his papers and prepared to leave, a new feeling filled his chest. It wasn't fear anymore. It wasn't insecurity. It was the certainty that, despite all the struggles, he was on the right path. He knew the road ahead was still long, but this had been his first true victory. Later, when he went out for lunch, the first thing he did was call Anna. He needed to tell her, "I did it, Anna. I made it." Not only did they listen, but they asked for more data. "I think I'm on the right track," Marcos said, his voice choked with emotion. On the other end of the line, Anna smiled, and Marcos could feel her positive energy coming through. "I knew you could do it. Don't doubt for a second that this is just the beginning. Now you can see where you really stand. I'm so proud of you." He felt the weight of his own fears begin to dissipate. The road was still full of obstacles, but in that moment, Marcos allowed himself to believe that he could keep moving forward. In the days that followed the meeting, Marcos felt a sense of relief, but also a growing pressure. He had taken the first step, but the road ahead was still far from smooth. He knew that, even though he'd achieved a small victory, the real battle was just beginning. The presentation of the data had been well received, but now he had to prove that his analysis was correct. The board's trust was still fragile, something he would have to earn every single day. At the office, things were a bit lighter, but not entirely. Some colleagues still seemed skeptical, though the respect for Marcos was more evident. He knew there was still much to prove and that the work wasn't over yet. There were adjustments and corrections he had to make, but now, at least, he had more room to breathe. As work at the company progressed, Marcos's personal life seemed to grow increasingly complicated. He felt distant from Anna, not physically, but emotionally. The conversations that once seemed simple were now becoming heavy, as if the words had to be weighed and measured. Marcos himself felt strangely distant from who he truly was, as if he were immersed in a role that didn't fully belong to him. He was struggling to fit his image of success into the picture he'd always imagined for himself, but the truth was, he still didn't see himself the way he wanted to. One night, after a long day at work, he decided to go for a walk. The cool night air seemed to help clear his mind. He walked through the empty streets, the city quiet around him. The lights of the buildings seemed to shine like little beacons, each representing a possibility, an uncertain future. Marcos stopped at a park bench, sitting down to watch the distant movement of cars. That's when his phone buzzed. The message was from Anna. "We need to talk." Marcos immediately felt the weight of the words. There was something serious in that "we need to talk," something that made him shiver. He took a deep breath before typing a response. "Of course. When and where?" The reply came almost instantly. "I don't want you to think I'm pressuring you, but I think it's time for us to be more transparent with each other." Marcos knew the conversation ahead wouldn't be easy. They'd both been dealing with distance, and maybe it was time to finally face what had been swept under the rug. They'd never spoken about the feelings that truly troubled them, nor about the future they saw, or didn't see, together. The meeting was set at the cafe they used to go to. Marcos arrived first, nervous, his hands sweating, still not knowing exactly what to expect from this conversation. When Anna showed up, He felt a mix of relief and apprehension. She had that soft smile, but her eyes didn't sparkle like before. Something was different, and he knew he needed to listen closely to what she had to say. They greeted each other with a brief, somewhat shy hug and sat down. Anna seemed hesitant, looking at him with a seriousness he wasn't used to seeing. "I don't really know where to start, Marcos," Anna began, her voice calmer than usual. "But I've been feeling that something's wrong. I noticed that you've been distancing yourself, not just from me, but from everything. I know you're facing challenges at work, and I know you're being hard on yourself. But there's something else, isn't there?" Marcos looked at her, feeling a tightness in his chest. He didn't know how to explain it, but yes, there was something more. He felt lost, as if he was playing a role, an expectation he'd created for himself, but it was no longer enough for him. He didn't know how to put it into words, but he knew he had to try. He started, his voice faltering slightly. "I don't know. I'm trying to be the person everyone expects me to be, but sometimes I feel so distant from myself, Anna. It's like I'm living a life that's not mine, you know? Like I'm always chasing something, but I don't even know what anymore." Anna fell silent, watching him closely. She'd always known him as someone determined, focused, but now she saw a different Marcos. Someone who was fighting something much bigger than he seemed to admit, someone who was losing himself in expectations and pressures. "I understand, Marcos," Anna said softly, "but you don't have to do this alone. I don't want you to be perfect for me, or for anyone else. I just want you to be you, with all your flaws, your doubts. I'm here for you, not because you have to be the best at everything, but because you matter to me, just as you are." Marcos felt a wave of emotion flood over him. He'd gotten lost in his solitary struggle, believing he had to be someone he wasn't. He felt the truth in Anna's words, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of relief, as if he were finally allowing someone to see his vulnerability without fear of judgment. I've been so hard on myself, Anna," he breathed deeply, trying to control the emotion that was taking over him. "I know I've made mistakes, and I know it hasn't been easy, but I don't know where to find the answers anymore. I just know that I need to change somehow." Anna smiled, but it was a sad smile, full of understanding. "And you will, Marcos. I know you will. Not for me, not for anyone else, but for you. Because you deserve to be happy, just as you are, not as others expect you to be." They sat in silence for a while, the conversation fading away, but Anna's words echoing in the back of Marcos's mind. He felt a relief, a kind of renewal. He finally understood that what he needed most wasn't the expectations of others, but his own acceptance. When he said goodbye to Anna, something inside him had changed. He didn't know what the future would hold, but he knew he would face it in a more authentic way, more true to himself. The conversation with Anna didn't resolve all of Marcos's dilemmas, but it was a turning point. He felt lighter, as though the weight of being someone he wasn't had lessened, but at the same time, he knew there was still much to face. He couldn't deny that the pressure was building as the deadline for delivering results approached. Anxiety was taking on more subtle forms, appearing in his thoughts during the day, at lunch, and even when he was trying to relax at night. That same week, a new meeting with the board was scheduled. It was a golden opportunity to solidify his position within the company, but the fear of failure followed him. He knew that his success depended on delivering more than just numbers. He had to convince the directors that his vision was the right one, and that was the greatest challenge of his career. In the days leading up to the meeting, Marcos threw himself into the calculations and projections. Every number had to be perfect, every analysis had to be solid. However, amidst the pressure, he began to feel the old ghosts resurfacing. Doubts, questions about his own abilities, and the fear of failure. It was no longer just about the numbers. It was about the feeling of being on the verge of something big that could all come crashing down with the smallest mistake. The night before the meeting, he received a call from Ricardo. "Marcos, are you ready for tomorrow?" Ricardo asked, his voice firm, but with a hint of concern. "I don't know, Ricardo. I'm going over everything, but I don't feel completely sure. I know I'm more confident than before, but this pressure is eating me alive. I feel like I need to deliver more than I'm capable of, Ricardo paused before responding. Look, I understand what you're feeling, and it's natural. Every big moment brings that fear, that feeling that we're not enough. But I'm going to tell you something. It's not about being perfect. It's about showing that you believe in what you're doing. That's going to be enough, my friend. It doesn't matter if the numbers aren't 100% right. What matters is that you show you're committed to your vision. Marcos sighed, feeling the weight of Ricardo's words. It was simple advice, but powerful. He needed to trust more in his intuition, in his vision, in his own strength. Thanks, Ricardo. I'll try, he said, taking a deep breath. The next morning, Marcos woke up earlier than usual, his mind racing. He knew he was facing a crucial moment, and every detail mattered. When he arrived at the office, his colleagues were gathered around the table, preparing for the big meeting. The atmosphere was tense, and he could feel the anticipation in the air. When the meeting started, Marcos walked into the room with a more confident posture. He was determined to show that he wasn't just there to present numbers, but to present a vision. The presentation was on point, clear, and direct. Marcos used his best persuasive skills, sharing the projections in an engaging way, explaining the growth potential and the risks involved. He knew the directors were looking for more than just numbers. They wanted to understand the story behind them. He had prepared everything carefully, but now he was putting everything he had into it. The room was silent as he finished his presentation, waiting for questions. The CFO was the first to break the silence, his expression serious. Marcos, your numbers are interesting, but you know we can't just trust projections based on such a volatile market like the one you're suggesting. What do you have to say about that? Do you really think this approach is solid? How can we be sure this won't be a failure? Marcos looked the CFO in the eye and, for the first time in a long while, didn't hesitate. He knew his answer wouldn't be perfect, but it would be honest. I can't guarantee everything will work out. No one can. But what I can guarantee is that the data we're seeing points to a real opportunity, and if we act now, we have a unique chance to take advantage of this market shift. I'm not asking you to bet everything on a single card, but I am asking you to recognize that by not acting, we might be letting a major growth opportunity slip by. I know there are risks, and I'm prepared to face them. But inaction might be the biggest risk of all. There was a pause in the room. The directors exchanged looks, weighing his words. Marcos remained silent, waiting for a response, his chest tight, yet feeling for the first time that he was being authentic, no longer hiding his insecurities. The CFO finally looked at him, and what seemed like a judgment turned into a thoughtful assessment. Marcos, you really believe what you're saying, don't you? The CFO asked, with a lightness in his tone that Marcos didn't expect. Yes, I believe it. Marcos replied, without hesitation. The CFO smiled slightly, as if he were seeing something he hadn't noticed before. He glanced at the other directors, then back at Marcos. Then let's go with your proposal. We'll start implementing these changes gradually. But Marcos, you know if this fails, the consequences will be serious, right? Marcos felt an immense relief. He knew he had taken an important step, but he also knew the game was just beginning. The opportunity had been given, and now he had to prove he could deliver. When the meeting ended, he walked out of the room with a mix of exhaustion and satisfaction. He had the chance to prove he was right, but he also knew the coming days would be crucial. As he walked back to his desk, he reflected on everything he had overcome to get here. He had transformed throughout this process, and no matter what happened next, he knew that the real victory was the confidence he had found in himself. At the end of the day, as Marcos was leaving the office, he picked up his phone and called Anna. He needed to tell her what had happened, to share the weight of this victory. Anna, you won't believe, he started, his voice calmer than usual. They accepted my proposal. It's not final yet, but we got it. I did it. On the other end of the line, she smiled, and Marcos could feel the joy she was radiating. It was as if, together, they were sharing that moment of achievement. I knew you could do it, Marcos. You're on the right path. Now all you need to do is keep believing in yourself. This is just the beginning. As he hung up, a sense of renewal washed over him. The work wasn't finished, but for the first time in a long time, Marcos felt in tune with himself. He knew that, no matter what came next, He was ready to face any challenge with courage, truth, and confidence. The next morning arrived with a renewed sense of purpose. Marcos woke up lighter, although the pressure was still there, like a weight on his shoulders. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but now he felt more prepared to face it. What he wanted most in that moment was some time to reflect, to think about what he had achieved, and, most importantly, what still needed to be done to solidify his position. When he arrived at work, Marcos met Ricardo, who was already waiting for him in the office. Ricardo's expression was one of approval, but also caution, as if he knew the success of the meeting was just one part of the bigger challenge ahead. "So, how do you feel?" Ricardo asked, smiling, but with the seriousness of someone who understood the real test was just beginning. Marcos sat down across from him and let out a long sigh. "I feel good, Ricardo. Relieved, even. But I know the pressure is going to get even more intense. They're not just going to expect results, they're going to want to see progress, and fast. I can't let this opportunity slip away, not now." Ricardo nodded in understanding. "That's true. But you've already taken the first step. The hardest one. Now, all you need to do is stay calm and stay consistent. They're counting on you, Marcos. Just don't lose your way." Marcos nodded. He knew he needed to find the balance between sticking to his vision and meeting the company's expectations. But above all, he felt like he had to stay true to himself, something he had struggled with over the years. The week went on with a frantic intensity. Marcos spent more time than ever at the office, aligning the next steps with the team and adjusting the action plans. But amidst the whirlwind of work, he noticed that his relationship with Anna had strengthened. They were opening up more, talking about their feelings, about the future. He knew that, despite the challenges he was facing, she was the one person who supported him unconditionally. And more importantly, she made him realize that no matter how tough things got, he wasn't alone. During one of these breaks, Marcos and Anna met for a quiet dinner, away from the hectic routine of work. They were at a simple, cozy restaurant, and the conversation flowed easily. "How are you, Marcos?" "Really?" Anna asked, looking him in the eye. The concern in her voice was subtle but striking. She wanted to know if he was truly okay, not just on the surface. Marcos put his fork down and smiled slightly. There was something genuine in his response. "I'm good, Anna. I know we still have a lot to face, but I feel like I'm finally starting to find myself. I don't want to be the person living to meet others' expectations anymore. I want to be someone who makes the choices they believe are right. And, as tense as things are, I feel like I'm on the right path." She looked at him with a soft smile, as if she had noticed the change in his demeanor. "I'm glad to hear that, Marcos. I always knew you had so much more inside of you than you realized. You just needed a little more confidence." Marcos took a sip of wine, reflecting on her words. It was incredible how, throughout his life, he had never felt good enough. But now, hearing Anna, he felt like he was, in some way, breaking those invisible chains that had held him back. He saw himself as stronger, more willing to take risks, to free himself from the limitations he had imposed on himself. The night went on, and Marcos and Anna continued talking about various things. But even with the lightness of the moment, he couldn't ignore the fact that the real battle was still ahead. The company wanted quick results, and he knew he couldn't afford to fail. The pressure to deliver on the promises made in the previous meeting was growing. He couldn't let his efforts be in vain. In the following days, Marcos focused on his plans, making adjustments here and there. But there was something that couldn't be ignored: the distrust from some of his colleagues. Even though his proposal had been accepted, he felt like he still had to prove himself to them, that his competence was still in question. This became more apparent when one of his more experienced colleagues, Marco Silva, not to be confused with him, approached him for a conversation. "I heard your proposal was accepted, Marcos. But you know the real test is coming, right?" Marcos Silva said with a cautious tone. "The numbers might look good now, but execution is what really matters. And frankly, I don't know if you have enough experience to make it work." Marcos felt the challenge in the air. He knew this was his time to show he wasn't there by luck, but by merit. He needed to stay calm and show he was up to the task. He looked at Marco Silva and, with a calculated lightness, responded, "I know the execution will be tough, And that's exactly why I'm here. I'm not an expert, but I'm willing to learn, to listen. I know what needs to be done, and if I fail, I'll fail trying. But I won't give up before trying. Marcos Silva looked at him, weighing his words. It wasn't exactly approval, but there was something there that showed a certain acceptance, a recognition that Marcos was committed to the work. The rest of the week passed in a whirlwind of decisions, adjustments, and meetings. Marcos was beginning to feel the weight of his role in the company. He knew that soon the consequences of his actions would unfold, and he could only hope he was on the right path. And as the weekend approached, Marcos couldn't help but think of something Anna had said. He was on the right path. Now, more than ever, he needed to believe that. Monday arrived with a tense energy. Marcos had spent the weekend reflecting on the next steps, the next phase of his journey. He knew the directors were expecting solid results, and the deadline was getting closer. His proposal, although accepted, still needed to translate into real results. The pressure to deliver something concrete was weighing on him, making him feel as though he were balancing on the edge of a cliff. One wrong move, and he could lose everything. As he entered the office that morning, Marcos was met with expectant looks. His colleagues were aware he was in the spotlight, and there was a mix of respect and skepticism in their gazes. He could feel the weight of each of them waiting for him to prove he was capable of carrying the burden now on his shoulders. He tried not to let it affect him, but it was impossible not to notice. He needed to lead, not just with words, but with actions. "How's everything, Marcos?" Ricardo asked as he approached his desk, his gaze curious, but also concerned. Marcos smiled, trying to appear more confident than he actually felt. "Everything's under control. Just some details to iron out, you know," he replied, straightening the papers on his desk. "But I'm prepared. What I need now is focus. I can't let the pressure get to me." Ricardo gave a thoughtful expression, as if weighing his words before speaking. "I know you're on the edge, but don't forget what you really want. Don't let yourself get swallowed by this game. You have a vision, Marcos, and that's what sets you apart. If you lose that, you lose everything. I know you can handle the pressure, but don't let it define who you are." Ricardo's words echoed in his mind as he started his day. Every meeting, every discussion about ongoing projects, every detail of the plan he had presented was being scrutinized under a microscope. He felt increasingly uncomfortable with the idea of being constantly evaluated, but he knew it was part of the journey. He was there because he had earned that space. Now, he needed to prove he deserved to keep it. Time passed quickly. Each hour felt like an eternity, but the moment of truth was approaching. Later that afternoon, Marcos received an unexpected call. It was from Anna. "How are you?" Her sweet and comforting voice brought him instant relief. "I'm good, Anna." "Well, at least I'm trying. The pressure's intense, you know? The directors expect something big, and I need to show I'm up to the task. But I'm trying to stay focused, not let fear paralyze me." Anna paused before replying, her voice soft but firm. "I know what you're going through, Marcos, but you don't need to prove anything to anyone but yourself. If you follow your intuition and keep believing in your potential, everything will work out. Remember who you are and what you're capable of. I believe in you more than anyone else, and I know you'll overcome this." Those words touched Marcos deeply. He needed to remember his own strength, the reasons that had brought him this far. He couldn't lose himself in other people's expectations. What mattered was moving forward, with courage and conviction. As the afternoon went on, Marcos felt his confidence being restored. He was in control, even though the pressure was almost unbearable. The meeting with the directors would be the climax, and he needed to be prepared for anything. When he sat down at the table for the meeting, a wave of adrenaline hit him. It was now or never. He took a deep breath, looked at each of the directors present, and began his presentation. But this time, he wasn't just talking about numbers and projections. He was speaking with passion, from the heart, showing not only what the data suggested, but what he believed was possible. He was talking about more than just a corporate project. He was talking about transformation, about a vision for a future that, though risky, could be brilliant. The CFO was the first to ask a question, one that could determine the course of the meeting. Marcos, are you really ready to implement these changes, knowing the risks? What can you guarantee us that this change will bring the results you're promising? Marcos felt the weight of the question, but instead of hesitating, he looked directly at the CFO and responded confidently. I can't promise that everything will be perfect, but what I can guarantee is that if we go in this direction, we'll have the chance to achieve something meaningful. I'm committed to this project, and I know we can make a difference, even if the path is challenging. I believe that, together, we can achieve what once seemed impossible. The CFO and the other directors exchanged looks. There was something different about the way Marcos was presenting his vision. It was as if he had taken on a new stance, an unwavering confidence that didn't come just from the numbers, but from a genuine belief in what he was doing. After a few minutes of silence, the CEO finally spoke, his voice calm but authoritative. Marcos, your approach is bold, and I like that. We'll move forward with your plan, but know that the eyes will be on you. This project will be your responsibility. Marcos felt an immediate relief, as if a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. But he also knew the real battle was just beginning. The approval was the first step. Now, he needed to ensure his vision became a reality. When the meeting ended, he left the room with a mix of euphoria and anxiety. He had won the first round, but the future was still uncertain. Like everything in life, success was just the beginning of something bigger. He needed to keep pushing, maintaining the confidence he had found in himself, and maybe, in time, he would prove he was right. That night, when he got home, Marcos called Anna again. They accepted it. It's happening, Anna. I'm on the path. She smiled on the other end of the line. I knew you'd make it, Marcos. There's nothing left to prove. Now, just keep moving forward, always believing in your potential. And, as Marcos hung up the phone, he knew that, no matter what happened, he was ready to face any challenge that came his way. He had found confidence in himself, and that was all he really needed. The following week flew by in a blur of intense activities and quick decisions. Every meeting, every detail of the project became an increasing pressure on Marcos' shoulders. He knew that the CEO's and the director's approval was just the beginning. The execution was what really counted, and all eyes were on his every move. He still had to prove that the trust placed in him was not misplaced. Over time, Marcos realized that, while the pressure was immense, he was starting to adapt to it. What had once seemed overwhelming was now just another challenge to overcome. He was beginning to enjoy the feeling of being at the center of a storm, yet staying calm. It was a mental and emotional game he was learning to master. But at the same time, he missed something essential. That sense of being with Anna, the lightness she brought to his life, now felt more distant. They had drifted apart a little, each caught up in their own responsibilities. Marcos longed for the peaceful moments they used to share, away from the tensions of work. One night, after another exhausting meeting, Marcos decided to call Anna. He needed a breather, a genuine connection. Anna, do you have time to talk? He asked, his voice more tired than he wanted to admit. On the other end of the line, her response came quickly, with a softness that made him relax. Of course, Marcos. How was your day? He paused, searching for the right words.
Tough.
I know we're on the right track, but the pressure's been constant. And I realize that with all of this, we've been drifting apart. I miss our routine, our peace. She listened in silence, understanding the concern in his voice. I understand, Marcos. I miss that too. But remember, we're both building something. I know things haven't been easy, but the important thing is that we're not alone. I'm by your side. Anna's words brought him a sense of comfort, something he hadn't realized he needed so much at that moment. I know, Anna, and I'm really grateful. You've always been the one to bring me back when I've lost my way. It means more to me than you know. There was a brief, but comforting silence before Anna responded. I'll always be here, Marcos. Even in the toughest times, I'll be by your side. No matter where you go, you'll always have my support. Marcos closed his eyes, feeling gratitude fill his chest. He knew that without Anna, it would have been impossible to handle the pressure, the challenges life was throwing his way. She was his foundation, the reason he could still stand firm. The night passed, but Anna's words echoed in his mind. The next day brought new responsibilities, new challenges, but Marcos now felt more prepared. He knew that, even in the midst of so much pressure, he wasn't alone. In the days that followed, Marcos began implementing the first changes of his project. It was a gradual process, but each small success brought with it a feeling of victory. He realized he was starting to build something solid, something that could truly make a difference in the company. But at the same time, doubts still lingered. Was he moving too fast? Was he making the right decisions? With each step, he felt the weight of the future on his shoulders, but he refused to stop. When Friday came, he allowed himself a break. He decided to step out of the office for a bit, to breathe, to clear his mind. He walked the streets, aimlessly, just seeking clarity. He knew he needed a moment for himself, away from the expectations and the watchful eyes of his colleagues. It was at a nearby park that he sat on a bench, looking around. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in golden and orange hues. Right then, in that simple and peaceful moment, he felt the peace he had been searching for. He didn't need grand explanations or solutions to every problem. He just needed time to understand his own journey. That's when his phone vibrated. The screen showed Anna's name. "Hey, Anna," he said, smiling when he heard her familiar voice. "Hey, love. I just wanted to check in. How are you doing? Was the week tough?" Marcos sighed, feeling the tension start to ease. "It's been intense, but I'm doing well. I'm just trying to find balance. The pressure's been pretty heavy, but I'm learning how to handle it." Anna breathed a sigh of relief. "That's good, Marcos. And I know you'll manage it all. Just don't forget that you're so much more than this job, more than all this pressure. You have immense value, and to me, you'll always be the Marcos who's passionate about what he does, but who also knows how to live life. Don't lose yourself." He smiled, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over him. "I promise, Anna, I won't lose myself. I'm focused now, and I know I can move forward with you by my side." They talked for a little longer, and Marcos felt the weight of the day lift. In that moment, he knew that, although challenges would never disappear, he had the strength to face them and the support he needed to continue his journey. When he returned to the office, the atmosphere felt different, lighter. Marcos didn't know what the future held for him, but one thing he knew for sure: he had found something more important than professional success. He had found true strength within himself, the confidence to take control of his life, and above all, the unconditional support of the person he loved. And that, more than any accomplishment, was what really mattered. The month flew by. Results started to come in slowly, but with a consistency that didn't go unnoticed by the directors. Marcos felt the weight he had carried at the beginning now lighter, more manageable. He knew he was on the right path, and the small daily victories began to accumulate, building a confidence he hadn't felt before. The pressure was still there, but he no longer let it consume him the way it had. He learned to breathe, to take it one step at a time. With every progress update, Marcos felt more fulfilled. He knew the end wasn't in sight yet, but he could already see the fruits of his hard work. The approving glances, the subtle praise from colleagues, all of it showed that he was doing things right. But behind every victory, there was still that quiet fear, that internal doubt. He knew the success of a project like this could be fleeting, and deep down, everything could collapse at any moment. But instead of letting that fear consume him, he learned to use it as fuel to stay focused, to keep pushing forward. One afternoon, as Marcos reviewed the final numbers and documents for the project, he received a message from Anna. They hadn't spoken as much as they'd liked, with both of their schedules becoming increasingly tight, but whenever they did talk, he always felt re-energized. "How's everything? I've been thinking about you. Just remember, you're not alone, okay? I'm here, supporting you every step of the way." The message, simple yet filled with care, was exactly what Marcos needed at that moment. He paused for a moment, put his phone down on the table, and allowed himself a genuine smile. He knew he could always count on Anna, and that made everything more bearable. The next day, as he prepared for the final meeting with the directors, he felt a mix of nervousness and excitement. This would be the culmination of all his hard work. No matter what happened after this moment, he knew he had given his best. The meeting began like any other. The directors were seated around the table, focused. But as Marcos looked at each one of them, he realized something had changed. It wasn't just the project that was being evaluated. It was him, his ability as a professional, as a leader, as a person. The CEO was the first to speak, his tone serious, but with a lightness that didn't go unnoticed. Marcos, we've been following your progress, and we've seen a lot of effort and dedication behind every step you've taken so far. I want you to know that we have confidence in your ability to deliver what you've promised. Marcos felt an immediate sense of relief. It wasn't a final victory, but it was a recognition he hadn't expected, but meant so much to him. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "I'm just doing my job, but every achievement, every step, is a reflection of the team effort. I wouldn't be here without everyone's support." The directors exchanged glances and nodded, as if they recognized the humility in Marcos's words. The CFO, with a more serious look, asked one final question. "Marcos, this project is going very well, but we want to know, do you have a long-term plan? How do you envision the future going forwards?" Marcos, without hesitation, looked directly at the CFO and replied, "The long-term plan is simple. Keep adapting, keep learning, and above all, never lose sight of the values that brought us here. This project is just the beginning. What I want is to build a solid foundation for the future, where we can all grow together. For me, it's about building something sustainable, something that lasts, not just in numbers, but in impact." The room fell silent for a moment. Marcos felt that he had exposed himself genuinely, showing not just his skills, but his vision for the future. The response seemed to have touched something in the directors, who began exchanging approving looks. Finally, the CEO stood, and with a subtle smile, extended his hand to Marcos. "Marcos, you're approved. We're ready to move forward with your proposal. I trust you to lead this. And remember, we have high expectations, but we know you're capable." The feeling that washed over Marcos was indescribable. A deep relief mixed with a wave of gratitude. He had done it. He had proven that, even in the face of adversity, he had the qualities needed to succeed. More important than the professional success, he had found confidence in himself. As he left the room, Marcos felt the weight of the past days of tension finally disappear. He no longer feared the future, because he knew he had the strength within to face whatever came next. When he got home that night, the first thing he did was call Anna. "I did it. They approved it. We're on the right track." On the other end of the line, Anna's voice came through, filled with contagious joy. "I knew it, Marcos. I knew you could do it. And I'm so proud of you. I can't even put into words how much." Marcos smiled, feeling the warmth of her voice, and said, "I couldn't have done it without you, Anna. You were my strength. And now, together, we'll conquer whatever else comes." In that moment, he knew that no matter what happened next, he had the most important thing, the certainty that his journey, with all its highs and lows, had transformed him into someone stronger, wiser, and above all, more confident. And with the support of the one he loved most, he was ready for whatever challenges the future might hold. Thank you for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our upcoming stories. Make sure to hit the notification bell to stay updated with more amazing content. Your support means a lot to us. See you in the next video, which is already on your screen.